Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves drifting down a narrow, crooked alley where the streetlights flicker like dying fireflies. You can almost feel the cold, damp bricks brushing your shoulders as you pass, because this alley was never meant to let people through. At the very end, where the path narrows into silence, stands a house, old, boarded up, forgotten by everyone except for the ones who dream about it. You know the one. The kind of house you swear you've never seen before, but it shows up in your dreams like it's always been there. Maybe you walk past it on the way to school. Maybe it's at the edge of your neighborhood. You think it's just abandoned, but it's not. Not really. And yes, I know you're probably thinking, I'm just here to unwind and fall asleep. And sure you might, if the whispering behind the walls doesn't reach your pillow first. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first time Elsie saw the house, she was 6 years old. It wasn't in a nightmare. It wasn't in a ghost story whispered between kids with scraped knees and flashlight-lit faces. It was just there, at the end of the alley, huddled between two cracked walls of old brick. No windows facing the front, no numbers on the rusted mailbox. Just a slanted roof like a spine arched in pain, and a warped wooden door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. She was on her way to her aunt's house with her father. He pulled her hand tight when she slowed to stare. "Don't look at that place," he said. "Why?" she asked. "Because it doesn't look back," he muttered, eyes fixed ahead. "And that's the problem," he never explained. And Elsie never forgot. Years passed. Her childhood blurred into adolescence, and eventually adulthood. The house faded from memory like a smudge on glass, still there, but too faint to notice. Until one summer evening when she returned to the city for work and rented a tiny studio apartment on Mayflower Street. The alley was still there, narrower than she remembered, with vines curling up its sides like hungry fingers. The kind of place the sun barely touched. She walked by it every evening on her way back from work, always at the same time, 7:23 p.m. The air shifted when she passed, cooler, denser, like the alley breathed differently. By the third week, she started to remember. The house at the end. One Friday, curiosity edged her steps closer. She stood at the mouth of the alley, hands stuffed in her pockets, just watching. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed. No wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. And then a faint clink. She turned her head. A coin rolled toward her from the alley. Old, worn. She crouched to pick it up, turning it over in her fingers. It was a subway token, one they hadn't used in over 20 years. Strange, but maybe someone had dropped it. She looked down the alley again. Nothing. But the air still held that breathless cold. That night, she dreamed of the house. It was clearer than anything she'd seen in years. She stood in front of it barefoot on damp stones. The door was cracked open just enough to let the dark peek out. She heard whispers but couldn't tell what they said. Then a soft tap, tap, tap from behind the door, like fingernails against wood. She woke up drenched in sweat. Her window was open. She didn't remember opening it. The dreams continued. Each night the house grew closer. She walked further into the alley. The whispers grew louder. Not words, just breath, forming shapes of meaning her mind wasn't ready to understand. On the 6th night, she heard her name. Elsie. It came from behind the door. She woke up with dirt under her fingernails and gravel in her bedsheets. Her shoes were still by the door, untouched. She stopped sleeping. The following Monday, she asked her landlord about the alley. He shrugged. "You're not the first tenant to ask about that old path. Most people don't notice it. Some, well, Some say it wasn't always there. What do you mean, it just kind of showed up again a few years ago? People say there used to be a house there way back when the city was still laying tracks. Then one day it burned down. But the weird part, no one remembers who lived there. No records, no blueprints, just the foundation and bad air. Elsie thanked him and left. That night she walked to the alley. She didn't know why. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was that strange pull in her gut like a magnet buried in her spine. But she found herself there again, holding the subway token like a talisman. The alley welcomed her with silence. Her steps echoed. She walked slowly, heart thudding in rhythm with her footsteps. The house was there, just like in her dreams. Real now. A window opened on the second floor. Someone was watching. She didn't run. Not yet, she whispered. Who's there? The door creaked. The light in the alley flickered once, and then the shadows moved. End of section 1. Say continue when you're ready for section 2. Elsie didn't remember moving. One moment, she was staring at the door, still slightly ajar, the alley behind her, breathing its chill into her bones. The next, she was on the porch, if it could be called that. Just 3 rotting planks that groaned under her weight. The door was open wider now, not all the way, just enough to tempt. The sliver of darkness inside felt thicker than night. She reached toward the edge of the door frame fingertips, brushing the flaking paint, and something inside her shifted, a memory maybe, or a warning. A whisper that sounded too much like her own voice saying, "Don't." But she pushed the door. It didn't creak like she expected. Instead, it opened with a soft exhale, as if the house had been holding its breath for years, and now, finally, could sigh again. The air inside was stale and cool, not with rot or mildew, but with stillness. The kind of silence that sits heavy in abandoned places where time forgets to move. Her eyes adjusted slowly, finding shapes in the dark, a hallway lined with peeling wallpaper, a crooked mirror reflecting nothing but shadows, and beyond it, a staircase swallowed by gloom. The floor beneath her felt uneven, sloping slightly toward the center of the house. She took a step. The floor whispered underfoot. Not with sound, but with memory. She didn't know what she was looking for. She told herself she was just curious that she would walk in, take a look, maybe prove to herself that the house wasn't real in the way dreams were, and then walk out. But with each step, she felt herself being absorbed. The walls stretched tall around her like ribs inside a giant creature that had been sleeping for too long. Faint lines etched the wallpaper shapes. Name's her name. No, just coincidence. She reached the end of the hallway where a doorway opened into what must have once been a living room. Faded curtains hung like ghosts from the windows, barely moving though there was no wind. A dusty sofa sat in the middle cushions, sagging under invisible weight. On the wall, a picture frame tilted sideways, the photo inside too smeared with age to see. But there was something behind the glass. A faint outline. 3 figures maybe. A woman, a child, and something else standing taller with a hand on the child's shoulder. She leaned closer, squinting, and the moment her breath fogged the glass, the room grew colder. She turned. The hallway was gone. Or not gone, but different. Longer. The entrance she'd come through was no longer visible. Instead, the house folded inward, growing like a paper maze, the walls tightening just enough to make her feel watched. She moved back through the doorway and into a different corridor now. The wallpaper was the same, but darker, soaked with age. At the far end, a door pulsed gently in the shadows. Something behind it moved. Softly. Rhythmically. Like breathing. She didn't approach it. Not yet. Instead, she turned into the nearest room. A kitchen, or what was left of one. The counters were warped. the sink crusted with old rust, and the cabinets hung open like mouths caught mid-scream. In the center of the floor was a small circle of soot, as if someone had lit a candle there. Around it, tiny markings were scratched into the floorboards, symbols, loops, something old. She knelt to inspect them, her fingers tracing the grooves without touching. The moment her shadow passed over the circle, the house shifted. She heard it not with her ears, but with her body. A deep creak like the foundation settling or awakening. Something in the walls exhaled again, and this time it didn't sound relieved. It sounded hungry. She stood quickly and turned toward the hallway. It was darker now, shorter. The breathing behind the pulsing door had stopped. A soft, rhythmic thump echoed through the floorboards upstairs. Footsteps, not hers. They moved slowly, one at a time. Not heavy, not loud, just deliberate. She froze, waiting. The sound continued for a few steps, then stopped. Silence returned, but it was a listening silence, and she was being heard. Without meaning to, she took a step backward. Her heel knocked against something. She turned. It was a music box, small, wooden, carved with vines along its edges. She didn't remember seeing it before. It sat neatly in the middle of the kitchen table as if waiting. The lid was slightly open. She reached for it, paused, then flipped the lid fully. The tune began slowly. Soft metallic chimes rang out in an old lullaby she almost recognized. Almost, but not quite. The melody felt twisted off by just a note or two, as if something had rewritten it. She stared into the open box. Inside was a small porcelain figure, a girl in a white dress turning slowly as the tune played. Her eyes were painted closed. Then as the melody reached its final notes, her eyes opened. Elsie gasped and stepped back, heart pounding. The figure stopped turning. The lid of the box snapped shut on its own. The footsteps above resumed, louder now, coming toward the stairs. She didn't wait. She turned, fled back down the hallway, searching for the front door for the way out. But the hallway twisted, bending left where it had been straight before. Doors appeared where walls had been. The house was folding itself around her. She passed a mirror and caught a glimpse of her reflection, but it didn't move with her. It stood still, watching. She stopped, looked again. Her reflection blinked and smiled. That was when she heard the door upstairs creak open. The thing that had been walking was now descending, slow, steady, one stair at a time. The footsteps didn't rush. They didn't falter. Each one landed with an eerie patience that filled the house like fog, seeping into the corners of every thought Elsie had left. It was the pace of something that didn't need to hurry, something that had already caught her in ways she hadn't realized. She gripped the edge of the wall, breath tight in her throat, and pressed herself flat against the faded wallpaper. The scent of age and damp wood curled around her. Somewhere hidden in the stillness between footsteps, she could hear the whisper of her own heartbeat. Not pounding, just steady but foreign, like it didn't belong in this place. Like her pulse was out of tune with the rhythm of the house. The stairs creaked. Another step, another. Then silence. She peeked out from behind the wall. At the base of the stairs, the hallway stretched impossibly long again, too long for the space the house had offered moments ago. Shadows filled the end of it so thick they seemed to lean forward like a tide waiting to surge. No figure stood on the stairs. But something had been there. She felt it like a vacuum of presence, a chill that left the wood warped where it passed. There was no point pretending this was just a dream now. The house had reached her, and it wasn't letting go. Still Elsie moved. She chose the hallway to the right one she hadn't seen before, though it branched from the living room like it had always existed. The wallpaper here was different, stripped bare in places, the wood beneath charred as if fire had once kissed the walls. Along the corridor, framed pictures hung askew, Children. Always children. Their faces blurred as though water had soaked through the canvas of memory and smeared them beyond recognition. She passed a door and stopped. It was half open, and the air behind it was warm, almost too warm, like the breath of someone standing too close. She pushed the door open with 2 fingers. Inside was a child's bedroom. The furniture was old, but intact. A small bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a wooden dresser, a shelf lined with stuffed animals whose eyes had long since lost their gleam. But it wasn't the furniture that made her step inside. It was the music, soft, nearly inaudible at first, but there beneath the hush of the house. A lullaby. Not the same twisted tune from the box, but one with real sweetness, real sorrow. Like someone had written it with tears still wet on the paper. On the bed sat a doll, hand-sewn, stitched mouth, button eyes, one missing. In its lap sat another subway token. Elsie reached for it slowly. The second her fingers touched the metal, the music stopped. The doll's head tilted. She recoiled, heart thudding harder now, the quiet no longer comforting, but stifling. The air thickened. The room dimmed, not from the absence of light, but from the pressure of memory returning. She looked at the token. It was the same kind as before, but older, darker. Scratched around the edge was something she hadn't seen on the first, her initials. Ella. Not impossible, she reasoned. Coincidence, maybe. She pocketed it anyway, feeling the weight press cold against her skin. As she turned to leave, the door behind her slammed shut, hard. The doll fell from the bed, rolled to her feet. She didn't scream. Instead, she knelt, picked it up, and placed it gently back on the mattress. Her hand trembled. "I'm just visiting," she whispered. The air responded with silence. That strange, listening silence again. But nothing moved. No sound followed. She turned the handle. The door opened easily now. No resistance. Back in the hallway, the house felt changed again, like it had turned slightly while she was inside the room. Everything was off by a few degrees. Nothing drastic. Just enough that her senses strained to compensate. She moved forward anyway, drawn not by fear, but by inevitability. The further she went, the more she felt the lines between her and the house blurring. Her thoughts weren't just hers anymore. They echoed, doubled, reflected. Down another hall, this one narrower ceiling lower. Dust fell in slow spirals from above. At the end of the corridor, a door glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. She reached it and paused. There were carvings in the wood, tiny ones made by a child's hand. Names, dates, little symbols, a sun, a crooked house, something that looked like an eye with lashes too long. Her fingers hovered over them, following the scratches, until she found one etched near the bottom corner. Elsie, 1997. Her breath caught. She hadn't been in this house. Not really. Not since childhood. Not that she remembered. But she had been here. Somewhere deep down, she knew it now. That day when she passed by with her father, he hadn't looked at the house because he knew. He had taken her away from it maybe only once. Maybe not enough. She turned the knob. The door creaked open into a nursery. A rocking chair moved gently, as if someone had just left it. A mobile above the crib spun slowly. The floor was scattered with tiny footprints. Dust had settled around them, not inside them, like the prints had been preserved. Waiting, she stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Elsie didn't turn to check the door. She already knew it wouldn't open, not until the room was finished with her. The nursery was dim, washed in a gray light that seemed to seep from the wallpaper itself. The patterns on the walls were childish clouds, trees, a sun with a smiley face, but the colors had all faded into a sallow beige, and some of the outlines bled together as if they'd melted over time. Or maybe something had tried to erase them. The crib stood in the center of the room, low to the ground, carved from dark wood with curved bars like fingers curled around a secret. Inside the mattress was bare, but the outline of a small body was still pressed into its fabric. A child's weight long since gone, but somehow preserved in memory. She approached slowly, her footsteps muffled on the old rug. A soft creak behind her made her stop. The rocking chair. It had picked up speed, gently swaying now, though the air was still. No wind, no breath, nothing to move it. Just momentum. Or presence. She forced herself to the crib's edge and looked down. The mattress was torn in one corner. Stuffing poked out like white moss. Beneath it, something glinted. She reached in. Her fingers brushed metal. Another token. This one was nearly black with age. When she turned it over, her breath caught. It didn't bear her initials. It bore her full name, Elsie Lane, not scratched crudely. Engraved, as if professionally made. The surface was smooth polished even, and it was warm. Suddenly, the music box tune returned. Not from the box she'd seen before, but from everywhere, from the walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the mobile above the crib, which had begun to spin in time with the melody. The shapes hanging from it weren't stars and moons, but tiny limbs, arms, legs, a doll's head. Not real, but not quite fake either. They spun with unnatural smoothness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The crib creaked. Not the frame, something underneath. She stepped back, heart slamming now, but her body moved slowly, as if the air had thickened into syrup. The rocking chair groaned loudly, then stopped. Dead still. A whisper curled around her ear. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of lips parting behind her. She turned. No one. The door opened on its own. She didn't wait to see what would follow her. She stepped out of the nursery and into another hallway. Longer. This time the walls were lined with mirrors. None of them matched. Different sizes, frames, shapes, some oval, some cracked, some fogged over. They didn't reflect the hallway properly. Some showed rooms she hadn't seen yet. Others showed her from behind. One showed her asleep. She stopped, watched. Her sleeping self twitched in the mirror as if sensing her gaze. The Elsie in the mirror opened her eyes. They were black. She blinked and stepped away. The reflection didn't follow. It just stared, then slowly smiled. She moved on, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes behind the glass tracking her every step. At the end of the corridor, a staircase led downward. It wasn't part of the house's original layout, at least not in her memory. But she didn't question it anymore. The house wasn't bound by blueprints. It shifted like a dream, like a memory that wanted to be remembered. She descended. The air changed again. Cooler now, but not musty. There was a cleanliness to it, a sterile emptiness that made her skin crawl. At the bottom was a door, white, plain, a brass knob without a lock. Her fingers hovered over it. Then she heard it clear this time, a child's voice. "Don't open it." She turned. No one. The whisper came again, closer now, as if spoken from right beside her. "Don't go down there, Elsie." She backed away from the door breath, catching in her throat. Her name again. Always her name. Spoken by something that shouldn't know it, or shouldn't still know it. But the voice had changed. It wasn't unfamiliar. There was something in it that scraped against a buried memory, like a name etched faintly in wood. She opened the door. Darkness. So total, it felt like a wall. But as she stood there, eyes straining, a shape formed. A hallway narrower than the rest, and at the far end, a faint orange glow. Flickering. A flame. Candlelight. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her. No footsteps followed. Only silence. The kind that draped itself over your shoulders and whispered in your ear not to breathe too loudly. As she walked, the candlelight grew, illuminating the walls, scratched with more names, dates, short phrases like, "I was here," or "Don't forget me." Some of them had been scratched through violently. Others repeated over and over like a desperate chant. She reached the end of the hallway and entered a small room, circular, stone-lined like a forgotten cellar. In the center stood a table with 7 candles. 6 were lit. 1 remained cold and unburned. Beside it sat a photo. She picked it up. It was her, a child, 6 years old, smiling in front of a birthday cake. Behind her stood her father, and behind him, in the blurry background, a shadowed figure at the edge of the frame, tall, pale, just out of focus. But looking straight at the camera, she turned the photo over. A date, May 7, 1997. Her 6th birthday, the day she saw the house. The 7th candle flickered. Then it lit on its own, and behind her footsteps returned. Elsie didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel the air behind her bending inward, like space itself was tightening, folding around a presence that had been there all along. The flame of the 7th candle wavered, but didn't go out. It burned with a soft, steady glow, casting shadows on the stone walls that moved even when she didn't. The footsteps stopped just behind her, so close she could almost feel breath on her neck, but the room was still cold. There was no warmth coming from the thing that had entered. Slowly, she placed the photo back on the table and took a step to the side, keeping her eyes on the candlelight. Her pulse slowed, not from calm, but from that quiet horror that comes when fear stops being a feeling and starts becoming fact. She spoke, though her voice came out quieter than she expected. "What do you want from me?" Silence answered. Then the room responded not with words, but with a subtle shift. The air turned damp, like the walls were breathing. A low hum vibrated beneath the floor, almost like distant machinery, or the purr of something ancient buried far below. She turned toward the far wall. A new shape had formed there, a door without a handle flush with the stone. Carved into it was a symbol she didn't recognize, an eye circled by 7 teardrops. The moment she looked at it, something behind her whispered again, but this time the voice didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded like her. Not her current self, but a younger version, timid and trembling. "I tried to leave." The words reached into her, threading through memory like needles pulling taut old stitches. She walked to the door and placed her hand on the center of the eye. The stone was warm. The wall pulsed. Then the door gave way, swinging open with no sound at all, revealing a room much too large to exist beneath the house. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. Candles floated in the air, suspended without strings, flickering softly in all directions. At the center of the room stood a circle of mirrors, 7 of them, each taller than a person, arranged like the points of a star. The 7th one, directly across from where she entered, was broken. The others shimmered faintly, reflecting not the room, but scenes, memories. She stepped toward one and the glass swirled like liquid clearing into an image. She saw herself maybe 10 years old, sitting on a swing, laughing with a girl she couldn't name. The memory faded, and another took its place, her older now in college, standing outside a dorm room, knocking, looking nervous. Then again, a different image, her as a child, standing in front of a house holding her father's hand. The house. This house. Elsie stepped back, breath shallow. She moved to the next mirror. This one showed a room dark, unfamiliar, but there was movement. A figure too thin, too tall, stood over a crib. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its hands, they were wrong. Fingers too long, bending the wrong way, hovering just above the blanket where something moved beneath. The candlelight from the floating flames caught its outline as it turned. For a split second, its face flickered into view. Not human, but not monstrous either. Just wrong, like it had been designed from memory, by something that didn't quite understand what a person should look like. The mirror shattered. She flinched. The sound was sharp but brief. When she opened her eyes, the shards had vanished. The mirror simply no longer existed. She turned to the next one, hesitant now. This one reflected nothing, only her. But not as she was. Her hair was longer eyes, paler skin sallow and grayish like someone left too long in the cold. The reflection raised its hand, and so did she. But it didn't match. The movements were off by a second, as though the glass was remembering instead of reflecting. Then the reflection stopped mimicking her altogether and smiled. A slow, sad smile that didn't reach the eyes. It whispered something, but the sound didn't carry. She backed away. Behind her something moved. Not footsteps this time, but a dragging, like someone pulling a heavy sack across stone. She spun around, but the room remained empty, except for the mirrors and the candles. The dragging continued circling the outer edge of the room, just beyond the light. She didn't chase it. She turned to the last intact mirror. This one pulsed with light before clearing. What she saw froze her. Her father, standing in the alley, looking at the house with a young Elsie beside him. He wasn't speaking, but his hand clenched tightly around hers, and on his face was fear, not confusion, not caution, but real, terrible fear. In the reflection, he bent down and said something to her. She couldn't hear it, but she remembered now. The words weren't about danger. They were about guilt. I should have never brought you back here. The scene faded. The mirror cracked but didn't break. Behind her, the dragging sound stopped. A whisper floated through the room. Now you know. And then, the seventh mirror, the broken one, glowed. Its jagged pieces began to rise slowly from the floor, reconstructing in midair. As they settled into place, the mirror shimmered once and showed nothing at first. Just fog. Then the fog parted, and behind it was the room she was standing in, but darker. She could see herself staring into the mirror, but her reflection wasn't alone. That tall figure with the wrong hands stood just behind her in the glass, not touching, not moving, just watching, and then the reflection moved. Not her. It raised a hand, pressed it to the glass, and from the other side of the room, something mimicked the gesture. A faint creak echoed behind her, low and long, like a neck turning slowly. Elsie didn't move, not even to breathe. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mirror where the figure behind her, the thing not quite shaped like a man, stood silently, one hand still pressed to the glass. Its fingers splayed two wide joints, bending subtly the wrong way. In the real room, she felt the pressure of something mimicking that exact gesture behind her, even though she hadn't heard it cross the space. She could feel it not in her skin, but in her bones. An ancient presence pressing through the air like fog down a throat, cold and thick. In the mirror, the version of her standing closest to the figure began to smile, but not with comfort. The smile was vacant, resigned, as if the reflection had been waiting for this moment to happen all along. The light from the candles flickered violently, shadows dancing in erratic shapes against the walls, and yet no wind moved. The room remained silent, holding itself like an exhale on pause. She turned slow and careful. There was no one there, only open space, and the circle of tall mirrors behind her, 6, still intact. The 7th, where she'd seen it, was now blank, cold, and lifeless again. The reflection gone. The shape gone. Only the feeling remained, that thick residue of being watched. The candle flames lowered all at once, dimming like gaslight, faltering. The temperature dropped. The mirrors fogged up at the same time, covering themselves in a breath that didn't belong to her. Then voices, low, soft, humming. Not words, but a murmur, like a choir buried under water chanting in rhythms without language. It came from behind the mirrors, all of them. Different pitches, different textures. Some sounded like children, others sounded too old. Her breath came fast now, though she tried to keep it measured. Panic wouldn't help her here. This wasn't a space that responded well to fear. It fed on it. She stepped back from the mirrors, careful not to turn her back completely, and walked toward the edge of the circle. The moment her foot crossed beyond it, the humming stopped. Just stopped, not faded, not tapered off. Gone. The silence afterward was worse. Then from far behind her, the sound of something wet dragging across stone returned. It wasn't trying to hide anymore. She turned her head slowly, keeping her body still, and looked toward the corridor she had entered from. Blackness. Nothing else. The dragging continued. She moved quickly now, circling the room's perimeter, searching for another exit. None. Only the door she'd come through, and she wasn't going back that way. She paused beside one of the mirrors and looked at her reflection. This time, it matched her perfectly. No delay, no distortion, but it blinked first, and then it spoke. Finish it. She backed away. Her lips hadn't moved, but the sound of her own voice echoed in the space. The reflection didn't smile. It looked tired. It looked like someone who had been here too long. Someone who wanted to leave. Maybe someone who had once tried to, and failed. And suddenly she knew what it meant. Finish the circle. There were 7 mirrors, one broken, now whole. But it had shown her something, a presence, a warning. The house wasn't just watching, it was recording. Each mirror was a memory sealed into glass. Some hers, some not. The only way out was through. Elsie turned and walked back to the center of the circle. The candles flared again, then calmed. She raised her voice, quiet but firm. I saw what you wanted me to see, I remember. The humming returned louder, now shaped into something like breath. The mirrors shimmered. In them, flickering images returned. Her childhood, her father's face, the edge of the alley, the photo of her 6th birthday, and then the house again and again and again. Each mirror repeated some piece of it, like pages in a book, read over and over until the corners curled and the ink bled. This wasn't a place where time moved forward. It looped, echoed, held onto certain things, and fed off the remembering. That was the key. Memory. The house thrived on what people had forgotten. That's why she'd been brought back. Not for punishment, for completion. Something shifted in the center of the room. She looked down. The floor beneath her rippled, like the stone was no longer solid but water masquerading as matter. The ripples grew outward. The candles flickered brighter. The mirrors lit from within. She knew, without knowing why, that if she stayed in that circle long enough, something would open beneath her. A way out, maybe. Or a trap. The figure returned in the mirror ahead of her. It didn't move. It didn't threaten. It pointed to the photo still in her pocket. She reached in slowly, pulling it out, her hand shaking. The same image, her 6th birthday, the blurred shape behind her father. But now there was something new. The photo had changed. A second child had appeared beside her in the image. A little girl holding her hand. Her face was turned slightly away, but Elsie could see the outline clearly. She wasn't alone that day. There had been another, the 7th child. The name on the token she'd picked up in the crib was hers, but the 7th candle had not been lit for her. It was lit for the other one. The one who had stayed. The one whose voice had whispered behind her. I tried to leave, Elsie whispered, now barely audible. Who are you? The mirrors cracked, not shattered, but cracked all at once. Long, thin lines across the glass. The image of the little girl appeared in every one, growing clearer. standing in the hallway, sitting in the rocking chair, watching from the mirror. Waiting in the crib, the girl looked up and for the first time spoke aloud, not in whisper, but in voice. "You left me here." Elsie's throat tightened. The voice wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was quiet, matter of fact. Not the voice of someone seeking revenge, but of someone simply stating what had happened and what couldn't be undone. The mirrors around her no longer shimmered. They burned softly from within, lit by a light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Each one reflected the same scene, now a child standing alone in the hallway of this house. Same shadowy corners, same cold wallpaper curling at the seams. The girl stood in silence, staring at Elsie from every angle. Her dress was white and old-fashioned, stained faintly at the hem. Her hair was long black, tangled over one shoulder. Her skin was pale in a way that didn't look quite natural, more like dust that had settled too long on something forgotten. In each mirror, her mouth moved in perfect synchrony. "You left me here." Elsie stepped back from the circle of mirrors. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't remember you." The girl didn't respond at first, but the images shifted. In one mirror, Elsie saw herself again as a child, younger even than 6, playing in what must have been a bedroom. Another girl was with her, this same girl, laughing, holding a toy, a music box. She turned the key and the tune began to play distorted and slow, the melody now unmistakable. Elsie watched as her younger self laughed, then looked directly into the mirror, as if she'd seen it even then. And just like that it came back, a summer, a visit. Not to her grandmother's house, not to her own home, but to a place her father had taken her only once. A friend, he'd said, an old friend from childhood. The man had lived alone, no wife, no neighbors nearby. Just the daughter, a quiet girl. She had spent one afternoon playing with Elsie in the nursery. Then, nothing. The rest had gone blank. Until now, she remembered the screams in the hallway, the slamming of doors, her father carrying her out in his arms while she cried, asking about her friend. And he said nothing. He never said anything. The memory had been sealed away, not erased, but buried. And this house was the one from that summer. The girl in the mirrors stepped forward in unison, all 7 at once. Her bare feet moved soundlessly over the floor in every reflection. The cracks in the mirrors deepened. The glass began to vibrate. "You promised you'd stay," she said. Elsie's voice trembled. "I didn't know. I was just a child." The room pulsed. "That doesn't matter." The girl's voice now carried an edge, not fury, not vengeance, but pain. So ancient it had turned cold, like stone smoothed by centuries of water. In one mirror, the reflection of Elsie's father appeared behind the girl. He looked younger, haunted. He reached out toward the child, but the mirror cracked across his hand, and he disappeared. "I waited," the girl said, "and you forgot me." Elsie knelt, placing the photograph gently on the floor at the center of the mirror circle. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I didn't remember until now." "I'm sorry." The humming returned lower now, more mournful. It wasn't coming from behind the mirrors anymore. It came from beneath them, from the earth itself. The circle glowed. Each mirror flared with a flickering silvery light, and then the center of the room began to sink a spiral motion like water circling a drain. The mirrors turned inward, not physically, but their reflections pulled together, overlapping into a single image, the girl standing alone in a doorway with a hallway stretching behind her. One by one, the candles above flickered and died until only one remained. The girl looked at Elsie through the combined reflection. Her voice still quiet, still even carried something new now. A plea. "Take me out." Elsie hesitated. Where, she asked. Anywhere but here. The floor cracked. The spiral deepened. The center of the room now opened into blackness, a perfect circle of void, bottomless, rimmed with tiny flickering lights, like fireflies dancing along the edges of memory. Elsie looked down and saw her own reflection again, not in the void, but above it, hanging in the air. Her older self staring back. But in this one, she held the girl's hand. That was the choice, not escape, completion. The house didn't want her soul. It wanted the story finished. Elsie stepped into the circle. The mirrors shattered all at once, but they didn't fall. The shards stayed suspended mid-air, frozen like stars, casting broken fragments of light around her. The girl appeared in front of her, not in reflection this time. She stood small and quiet, the way Elsie had remembered her exactly as she'd been that summer. She reached out her hand. Elsie took it, and they fell together into the spiral. The fall was soundless. No rush of air, no sense of speed. Just darkness stretching endlessly in every direction, folding over them like velvet. Elsie didn't know if they were descending, drifting, or suspended in some limbo between space and thought. The little girl's hand remained cool and steady in hers grip, neither tight nor fearful, but constant like an anchor, keeping her from unraveling entirely. Around them, the shards of shattered mirrors floated downward at their own pace, glinting with fractured seams. Her father's face behind the wheel of an old car, the blurred hallway of a forgotten childhood memory, the doll in the crib turning its porcelain head, the figure with backward fingers watching from the corner of a room that no longer existed. Each fragment caught her eye, pulled at her, but she kept moving. Or maybe the spiral kept moving her. Eventually they landed, not with impact, but with stillness, like stepping onto a memory softened by time. The ground beneath them was wooden, though it gave slightly underfoot as if soaked through with something cold. Around them stretched a long hallway, dimly lit by flickering sconces that looked like they hadn't held real flame in a century. The wallpaper here was intact, faded but not peeling. Familiar, though she couldn't place it. The girl let go of her hand and walked ahead barefoot across the uneven floor, not speaking, only moving toward a door at the end of the corridor. The door was open, casting a warm glow that pulsed gently, like the heartbeat of the house. Elsie followed. Inside was a nursery, but not the distorted version she had seen earlier, not haunted or rotted or soaked in silence. This one was preserved in time. A small bed with clean sheet shelves lined with toys, a soft chair in the corner with a knitted blanket draped across the arm. It even smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. The mobile above the crib spun slowly on its own, playing a tune she now remembered fully, the lullaby the little girl had played that summer afternoon so long ago. This was before the shadows, before the forgetting, before the mirrors and whispers. The girl sat on the edge of the bed. "This is where I stayed," she said softly. Elsie sat beside her, feeling the mattress shift slightly under the child's weight. "And no one came for you." The girl looked down at her hands. No one remembered to. Elsie felt a guilt deeper than any shame she'd known, not because she had made a choice, but because she hadn't known there was one. How many children had been swallowed by places like this, not in body, but in memory, erased, forgotten, left behind in the folds of old houses that hungered not for flesh, but for stories untold. "You were real," Elsie whispered. The girl nodded once. "I still am, but I'm tired." Silence settled over the room like a blanket. Elsie's mind drifted back to her own life, to the studio apartment on Mayflower Street, to her job she hadn't thought about since entering the alley, to the quiet ache she'd always felt, but never named. This house had called her not because she owed something, but because she had the space to remember. That made her different. That made her the door. "You don't have to stay here anymore," she said quietly. The girl looked at her, and for the first time her expression changed. Hope, fragile and cautious, flickered behind her tired eyes. "Will it let me leave?" Elsie didn't know, but she stood anyway, offering her hand again. "Let's find out." As the girl reached for her, the nursery began to dim. Not fade, not collapse, but drift. Like the house itself was unsure whether to hold on to this room or let it dissolve. The mobile above them slowed the lullaby, winding to a close. The walls pulsed once with that familiar breathing silence. Then without a sound, the floor beneath them shimmered and peeled away into darkness. They stood now in the alley, back in the alley, night air cool against their faces, real gravel beneath their feet. The house was still there behind them, but it looked different, older, collapsed in on itself like it had finally exhaled its last breath. The door hung crooked on one-hinge windows, dark and lifeless vines climbing the exterior, as if trying to erase it from sight. No light, no presence, only ruin. The girl turned to it and whispered, "Thank you for letting me go." The breeze stirred the alley's silence. Nothing responded, and yet everything did. Elsie felt the girl's hand grow lighter in hers. She turned to find her fading gently like steam rising from warm earth. Not vanishing, not erased, but released. Before she disappeared completely, the girl smiled. "You remembered?" Then she was gone. Elsie stood in the alley alone. The city noise returned gradually, a distant horn, the rumble of footsteps, the hiss of a bus. She hadn't aged. The token was still in her pocket, and her shoes were still clean. But something deep inside had shifted. The story was done. She walked away without looking back. Days passed, though Elsie couldn't say how many. The return to her normal life felt uneven, like stepping back into a version of the world that had been subtly reassembled in her absence. The alley still existed, tucked between the same crumbling brick walls, dark and narrow. But the house at its end was no longer there. Just a flat patch of gravel and weeds where a foundation had once been. City workers had moved in with heavy equipment, leveling what little remained. No one, she asked, remembered the building that used to stand there. Not her neighbors, not the landlord, not the older woman at the corner flower shop who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades. "You mean that empty lot," she said, peering over her glasses. "Been like that for years. Nothing's ever stuck there. Developers keep buying it, then backing out. They say the ground's wrong." Elsie only nodded. She didn't press. She slept better now. Strangely better, in fact. Her dreams were quieter, no longer burdened by whispering shadows or shifting corridors. But they weren't empty. From time to time, she dreamt of the little girl, not trapped, not pleading, just present. Sometimes they sat in the nursery playing with toys that no longer existed. Other nights they walked through a forest made of mirror glass, where the sky shimmered like candlelight and nothing ever chased them. Elsie would always wake up with the feeling that someone had said goodbye softly just before dawn. But even in daylight, signs lingered. A subway token found in her coat pocket, though she hadn't worn it in weeks. A lullaby humming faintly through her apartment's radiator, only audible between 3 and 4 a.m. A child's laughter carried on the breeze when she passed playgrounds, even if they were empty. These things didn't frighten her. Not anymore. They were fragments, echoes, gentle reminders that some stories don't end, they just find peace. One morning, as she prepared for work, she found an envelope slipped under her door. No return address, no name. Inside was a photograph, old and slightly bent. She turned it over and her breath caught. It was the same image from before her 6th birthday, the cake her father behind her. But this time the background was different. The house was gone. In its place, a garden bloomed behind them. Wildflowers, tall grass, sunlight. And the little girl was no longer standing in the shadows. She was sitting beside her, smiling. A real smile, unblurred, whole. Elsie set the photo on the counter and sat down, a quiet feeling blooming inside her chest, one that had nothing to do with fear, or even memory. It was the sense that something long closed had quietly unlocked. She took the subway to work that day, the token still in her pocket. She didn't need it, not anymore, but it felt right to carry it. Like carrying a name, like carrying a story. As she stepped off the train and into the crowd, someone brushed past her. A woman maybe in her early 30s with pale skin and long black hair tied back in a ribbon. She didn't say anything, didn't even look back. But in her hand was a music box. Elsie saw it clearly before the woman turned a corner and disappeared. She smiled. Some doors never truly close, but sometimes they stop needing to be watched. The city moved on as it always does, humming and blinking and sighing under its blanket of light and noise. But Elsie's world had slowed. Not in a way anyone else would notice. She still went to work, still bought groceries, still took the same route past the alley each evening. But within her, something had quieted. The restlessness she'd carried for years, that unnamed tension always humming beneath her thoughts, had eased. It was as if the echo in her bones had finally found an answer. She didn't need to stare down that alley anymore. But sometimes she did not with dread, but with something close to reverence. A place that had once taken something from her had also returned something far older, herself. One evening, after a long shift and a slow walk home, she passed a child on the sidewalk, standing alone near a street lamp. The little boy couldn't have been more than 5, dressed in a red hoodie, too big for his frame. He was staring intently at something, his hand held out palm up, catching nothing but empty air. Elsie slowed beside him. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded but didn't look at her. "She dropped it," he said. Elsie glanced around. "Who?" He finally looked up. His eyes were a soft gray-blue, wide and oddly calm. The girl. She was holding a music box. Elsie's chest tightened. "Did she say anything to you?" The boy shrugged. She smiled. Then she walked through the wall. Elsie followed his gaze to the side of a building. Nothing but old bricks and vines. She knelt beside him, the sidewalk cool against her knees. What did the music box look like? The boy turned his hand over and opened his fingers. In his palm sat a tiny key brass delicate shaped like a treble clef. "She dropped this," he said. Said it wasn't hers anymore. Elsie took the key carefully. It was warm, just like the token had been. "Did she tell you her name?" He nodded once. She said, "Tell her I like the flowers." Elsie blinked but didn't ask how the girl had known. She just smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. "Thank you for telling me." The boy smiled, then turned and walked toward a group of waiting parents on the other side of the park. She watched until he was gone. That night, she placed the key beside the subway token and the photograph on her desk. No ghost had followed her home. No shadows clung to the corners. But when she looked at those 3 small objects together, she felt something settle into place. The kind of peace that didn't erase pain, but folded it gently into the past where it belonged. Later, as she lay in bed with the window open, she heard the faint music again, soft lilting carried on the breeze like a forgotten song just remembered. The lullaby was whole this time, each note clean and sure. No distortion, no sadness. It played once, then faded into the silence. In the dream that followed, she walked through a field of wildflowers. The sun was warm. The sky had no edge. And beside her walked the girl, older now. Maybe 10, maybe 12. They didn't speak. There was no need. They just walked, and far behind them on the horizon, a small house sagged gently into the earth. Its windows open its doors, unlatched. Empty now, but no longer lonely. The days blurred into one another, as they often do when nothing dramatic interrupts their rhythm. Elsie found comfort in the ordinary, not because she craved routine, but because it gave her mind the quiet it needed to process the unexplainable. The house, the girl, the mirrors, they no longer haunted her, but they hadn't faded either. They lived somewhere behind her thoughts, like a familiar hum in a room where the light always flickered just a little. She kept the token, the key, and the photograph on her desk, neatly arranged on a piece of linen untouched, except for the occasional glance. She didn't need to touch them to know they were still charged with meaning. And some evenings, when the air felt heavier than usual and the sky outside her window turned a deeper shade of blue than she remembered being possible, she would light a small candle and sit beside them. She wouldn't meditate or ask questions. She would simply be. And somehow that felt like enough. But the story wasn't quite finished. It began again on a Thursday evening over dinner with her friend Cora. They hadn't seen each other in months, and their conversation was warm, familiar, full of those soft pauses that happen between people who don't need to fill every silence. They sat at a small table near the window of a quiet restaurant, the clinking of silverware and murmured conversations around them serving as a comfortable backdrop. They spoke about work, family, the strangeness of being in their 30s, and how dreams felt more vivid lately. It was only near the end of the meal over shared dessert that Cora hesitated before asking a question that tugged at the quiet thread Elsie had tried to let rest. "Did you ever find out what happened in that alley near your place? You used to mention it sometimes." Elsie looked up, fork still in her hand, and tried to read Cora's expression. It was casual, innocent, but something in the way she asked made Elsie pause. "I did," Elsie said simply. "There was a house there, but it's gone now." Cora nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember. I think I saw it once. Or maybe I dreamed it. I used to have this strange feeling walking past that alley, like someone was staring from a window that wasn't there. I don't know. I figured it was just stress." Elsie studied her for a moment. "What kind of dream?" Cora shook her head, smiling uneasily. "It's probably nothing. Just weird stuff. A little girl mostly. I'd see her sitting on my windowsill, but not from the outside. Like she was inside the glass somehow, and I was the one looking in. Always holding a music box." Elsie didn't smile. Her heart beat slower. "Did she ever say anything?" Cora's gaze drifted toward the window beside them, and her voice lowered. "Only once. She said, 'It's not my story anymore.' Then she disappeared. After that, I stopped dreaming about her. It was a few months ago." Elsie sat still, the fork resting gently on her plate. The restaurant's soft buzz faded into the background as the realization washed over her. The story was shifting. Not just ending, but changing hands. Cora glanced back. "That's a weird look on your face." Elsie shook her head with a faint smile. "No, not weird. Just familiar." That night, back at her apartment, she sat down at her desk. She didn't light the candle, didn't touch the items. She simply looked at them. The photograph, the key, the token. The weight of them had changed. What once felt like anchors now felt like messengers. Their job wasn't to hold her down, it was to let her know she could move on. But that didn't mean they wouldn't speak again in quiet ways through other people in passing dreams or half-remembered melodies. These kinds of stories never truly vanish. They settle. They pass into others who are open enough to notice. A breeze moved through the apartment. Her window was closed. She didn't look for the source. Instead, she reached into the drawer and pulled out an empty notebook. On the first page, she wrote a name. Just one. Grace, no last name. No explanation. Just the first word in what might be someone else's story. Someone else who had waited. someone else who might soon be remembered. She closed the notebook and left it there beside the photograph. The candle flickered on its own and then went still. Outside, the wind carried a faint melody, the kind that only some people hear. Elsie didn't tell Cora everything. Not because she didn't trust her, but because some things, once spoken, lose the shape they held in silence. Words had a way of shrinking the unexplainable into something too neat, too digestible. And this story, this presence, this truth, wasn't meant to be tidy. It was meant to be carried. So she let Cora's curiosity settle unanswered, trusting that if the girl in the glass ever came to her again, she would know what to do. That same night, Elsie returned to the alley not out of fear or obligation, but with a strange sense of duty. The lot where the house once stood had been cleared as if scrubbed from the earth by something greater than machinery. Not a single piece of brick or broken wood remained, just dry dirt too fine to have been dug recently, and a row of construction cones that had been left in no particular order. She stood at the edge listening, not for footsteps, not for whispers, for the absence of them. And it was there. The stillness was no longer heavy, it was whole. Whatever had once clawed at the edges of memory had been released not in a violent shattering, but in a slow, deliberate uncoiling. The house hadn't been destroyed. It had finished its story. She wondered how many others had passed through it over the years, unknowingly playing parts in a script they didn't remember writing. How many had brushed shoulders with the forgotten and walked away feeling just a little hollow, never quite knowing why. She didn't need the answer. Back at her apartment, she retrieved the notebook again. The name she'd written, Grace, lingered on the page with the weight of something unfinished. She stared at it a long time before flipping to the next page and beginning to write. Not fiction, not memory, but something in between. She wrote about the alley, about the mirrors, about the girl in the music box, and the seventh candle that lit itself. She wrote until the candle beside her burned low, and the page was filled with words. She hadn't planned sentences that emerged from some place older than thought. She didn't reread what she'd written. She didn't need to. When she set the notebook down, it felt heavier than before, as if the story itself had slipped inside the spine and folded itself into the binding. In the following days, strange things began to shift, not in her apartment, not in the city, but in her interactions with people. She noticed it in brief glances and offhanded comments, in the way strangers paused mid-sentence like they were hearing something behind them. One morning on the subway, a child seated across from her hummed the lullaby softly, his mother unaware, scrolling her phone. Another evening at a bookstore, she watched as a woman reached for a music box on a high shelf, then froze staring at it as if something ancient had moved inside her chest. She didn't speak, only returned it gently to its place and walked away. Elsie understood now. The story had become a current, not haunting, carrying. Every memory recovered fed a thread that wound deeper into the fabric of forgotten places, and she perhaps only for a time was something like a keeper. Not a chosen one, just someone who had stayed long enough to remember. That night a quiet knock echoed at her door, not forceful, not repeated, just one. She opened it and found no one in the hallway, only the usual hum of the building. But at her feet sat a small wooden box, not ornate, not antique, just plain and closed tight with a rusted latch. She picked it up, brought it inside, and placed it on the kitchen table. For a long while, she just sat across from it, unsure if opening it would begin another story, or end the one she was still inside. Eventually she reached for it. The latch opened easily. Inside was a folded piece of cloth and a single photograph. The cloth was a child's scarf, white with faded embroidery in the corner that read M. The photo showed two girls. One was her. The other she didn't recognize, but her hand was resting on Elsie's shoulder, and her eyes were filled with something warm. On the back, a date was scrawled in pencil, August 12th, 1996. No other notes, no names. But in the space between the lines, Elsie understood. It wasn't over. Not quite. The house had closed, yes. But the children who had passed through it, the pieces of them lost in mirror fragments and silent cribs, were still finding their way back. And some of them had stories left to tell. Elsie kept the box on her desk beside the scarf, and the second photo next to the original 3 objects that had started everything: the subway token, the music box key, and the photograph from her 6th birthday. They no longer felt like relics. They felt like threads, each tied to something larger, something still unfolding. That night, as the city blurred into its midnight rhythm and the glow of apartment windows dimmed across the skyline, she sat in her chair with the window open, listening. Not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the spaces between sounds. That quiet space where stories waited. She ran her fingers over the scarf, tracing the embroidered M. There had been no mention of a child with that name. No dream. No reflection. And yet something in the texture of the fabric stirred a recognition in her chest, one that didn't come from her memories, but from a deeper, more ancestral place. As if she had once sat beside this child without ever knowing her name. Perhaps in a waiting room or in the corner of a playground long forgotten. Perhaps they had simply passed in a hallway somewhere, eyes never meeting, fates brushing for the briefest moment. Later that evening, her sleep came quickly, and with it, another dream. She stood in a field of tall, dry grass that reached her hips. The sun was gone, but the sky glowed faintly, tinged with the soft blue of early dusk. Wind passed through the grass in long, rhythmic waves. Somewhere ahead, a single tree stood on a hill, tall, skeletal, no leaves. Under it, a figure sat quietly back against the trunk. Elsie walked toward it, her feet soundless against the earth. As she got closer, the shape grew clearer. A girl, perhaps 9 or 10, sat with her legs drawn to her chest. She wore the white scarf tied loosely around her neck. Her hair was dark and blunt. Cut her knees scraped like she'd fallen more than once, and learned not to cry about it. She looked up as Elsie approached. Her expression wasn't sad nor angry, nor even expectant. It was tired, not from lack of sleep, but from waiting. A long, patient kind of waiting. Elsie knelt beside her. "You're M," she said gently. The girl nodded. "I don't remember you." "I know. I'm sorry." The girl shrugged her eyes, focused on the horizon. "It's not your fault. They forgot me before you were even born." Elsie didn't speak. There were no words heavy enough to meet that kind of silence. The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in a corner of cloth. She held it out. Elsie took it. It was a piece of mirror, not sharp, smooth around the edges as if worn down by years of being passed from hand to hand. In the reflection, Elsie didn't see herself. She saw a room, not one she recognized, but she felt the shape of it in her body, the smell of it, the dust in the corners, a toy horse on a shelf, a name scratched into the bedpost, faint and shallow, Margot. "M," she whispered. The girl nodded again. "I lived there," she said, "but the house forgot. It took everything that didn't fit the others." "And now?" Elsie asked. "Now it's quiet, but I'm not sure where to go." The wind picked up in the dream, rustling the field, bending the grass low. The tree above them creaked branches, clicking together like old wooden chimes. Elsie placed the mirror shard into her own pocket. The girl watched her, blinking slowly. "You're not like the others," she said. "You remember for more than yourself." "I try." The girl looked back toward the horizon. "Maybe that's enough." Elsie didn't wake with a start. She opened her eyes slowly, the morning light soft against the ceiling. The breeze through her open window was real, and in her pocket, the mirror shard waited. No sharp edge, just a reflection, The scarf still lay folded on her desk. That day, she didn't go to work. She walked through the city instead, carrying nothing but the shard and the scarf in her bag. She passed playgrounds, bookstores, churches, underpasses. She stopped at parks and watched strangers pass. She listened to laughter, to crying children, to street musicians playing out of tune. By late afternoon, she found herself standing in front of a library she hadn't visited since high school. Something tugged at her there, a soft thread in her chest. She stepped inside. The building was nearly empty. She walked past the front desk, past the shelves of bestsellers, past the study cubicles, and the quiet typing of laptop keys, until she found herself in the children's section. It smelled the same. Paper, old glue, crayon wax. She sat down in one of the beanbag chairs in the far corner and opened her bag. She placed the scarf on her lap and held the mirror piece in her hand. It didn't show her a reflection now, just light, soft and flickering. After a while, a small girl wandered over. She wore a Navy school uniform and held a picture book in her hands. She stared at the scarf, then at the shard. "That's pretty," she said. Elsie smiled. "It belonged to someone named Margot." The girl nodded solemnly, as if that explained everything. Then she sat on the beanbag next to her and opened the book. For a long while, neither of them spoke. When the girl's mother eventually came to find her, Elsie folded the scarf and mirror shard back into her bag. As she left the library, she felt lighter. Not because she had finished something, but because she had shared it. Sometimes that's all a memory needs to live again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so calm, it felt suspicious. Elsie went back to work, greeted neighbors in the hallway, ran errands, and cooked her dinners without a second thought. Her apartment grew warmer, more lived in, not from anything visible, but from something invisible that had shifted. The fear was gone, yes, but more than that, the waiting was gone. For the first time in a long time, she felt like time was moving with her, not pulling her backward. And yet, like threads of wind slipping under a closed door, she could still sense it, the unfinished. Not a haunting, not an omen, but something closer to a voice. In the next room paused mid-sentence, waiting to be remembered again. It came back, not in a nightmare, but in a whisper of scent chalk dust and dried lavender while she was grocery shopping. One moment she was browsing the tea aisle, and the next, her mind filled with the image of a staircase with 6 wooden steps, all uneven one, with a missing nail. She had never seen it before, not in any dream or memory she could name. But her feet knew the weight of those steps. Her hand remembered the feel of that railing. When she blinked, she was standing still in the aisle, a box of herbal tea in her hands, its corner dented slightly, as if it had been dropped once before. She bought it anyway. That night she opened her notebook again, flipping past the page marked Grace, past the page marked Margot. The next page she left blank, but she folded the corner sharply, a silent invitation to whatever name needed to come next. She left the notebook open beside the candle, now a routine she no longer questioned, and sat quietly on her balcony, the city humming far below. A light breeze brushed against her cheek, bringing with it the faintest sound, the tapping of chalk on slate. She didn't sleep long that night, but she dreamed deeply. In the dream, she was inside a schoolhouse long abandoned. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she walked past empty desks, sunlight streaming through tall windows that looked out onto nothing but fog. At the front of the room stood a blackboard. A single name was written on it in long, slanted cursive Clara. No child was present. No voice echoed from the corners. But Elsie knew the way one knows a tune before hearing its first note, that Clara had been here. that she had waited not for rescue, but for remembrance. The chalk moved on its own, etching slow lines under the name. A sentence began to form. I didn't want to go home that day. Then the fog thickened, bleeding through the windows, swallowing the light. When Elsie woke, the word Clara was already written on the next page of the notebook. She didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember holding a pen, but the ink was fresh, still wet in places. She stared at the name for a long while, then flipped back to the beginning. Grace, Margot, Clara, 3 names, 3 children, 3 fragments of something larger than herself. The notebook no longer felt like a journal, it felt like a map, not to places but to stories. She began to draw lines between the names, patterns, not quite a family tree, not a timeline either, more like a constellation, each story orbiting a central absence, a place that no longer existed, a place that had once contained them all. The house, but not the house, the one on Alley 7. No, that one was just a door. There were others. The realization arrived not in a burst, but in a soft unfolding, like the way darkness lifts slowly from a room in the morning. Every story had to begin somewhere, yes, but sometimes beginnings are borrowed. Sometimes a soul enters through one threshold and leaves through another. These children, these names, they didn't all belong to that same house, but they all belonged to a house, different facades, different cities, different years, but the same memory beneath. Elsie leaned back in her chair and whispered aloud, "How many are there?" The flame of the candle fluttered once, then steadied. The next morning, she received a letter. No return address again. This one was thicker than the first. Inside was another photograph, this time in color. A group of children on a field trip standing in front of a long abandoned farmhouse. Most smiled. One did not. A boy, maybe 12, stood to the far right eyes, narrowed hands buried deep in the pockets of a coat that looked too large for him. His name was scribbled faintly on the back in blue ink, Jeremy. The moment she touched the photo, her ears filled with the sound of wind whipping through broken rafters, and somewhere in her apartment, though she was alone, a voice said clear and close, "He never came back from the attic, Jeremy." The name echoed through Elsie's mind all day, soft and slow like footsteps on old wood. She carried the photo with her, tucked between the pages of the notebook. She didn't stare at it obsessively. There was no need. The boy's expression had burned itself into her memory in an instant. Not fear, not sadness, resignation. As if the photo had been taken moments before something happened, and he already knew what it would be. That night, the wind rose early, brushing against the windows of her apartment, like fingers searching for entry. The candle on her desk flickered long before she lit it, and the air smelled faintly of dust and pine, the scent of a dry attic in late summer. She sat by the window, notebook open, and let the city's noise blur into static. The photograph of Jeremy lay beneath her hand, warm despite the coolness of the room. She flipped the notebook to the next blank page and wrote his name slowly across the top. Beneath it, her pen hovered, unsure where to begin. So she waited, and in time, the dream found her. The attic was impossibly narrow, pitched steeply beneath a sagging roof. Wooden beams bent in strange arcs like ribs, and the floor beneath her feet creaked with every breath. Dust hung in the air, like fog curling through broken slats of sunlight that poured through small, round windows. Boxes were stacked in tall, tottering piles, their labels faded, some half-opened, revealing fragments of forgotten lives, a single shoe, a rusted pocket knife, an empty birdcage. In the center of the room, a boy stood facing the wall. Jeremy. She knew it was him before he turned. His coat hung off one shoulder. His hands were tucked into the pockets. His hair stuck up in the back as though he'd just woken from sleep. But it wasn't sleep that had taken him. It was waiting. He turned slowly, as if hearing her arrive had taken effort. His face was the same as in the photograph, only older in the eyes. Not older by years, but by knowledge. The kind of knowledge you don't ask for, and once gained, can't be unlearned. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, not angry, not surprised, just tired. "I came because you didn't leave," Elsie replied. He looked around the attic. That's the problem. No one ever really leaves. They just get folded into the corners. You think an attic holds things. It doesn't. It collects them. She stepped closer. "What's keeping you here?" He gave her a long look, then tilted his head toward a box behind him. "It's in there." She approached the box carefully. The lid had already been pried open. Inside was a bundle wrapped in cloth. She pulled it free. The cloth was thick, stiff with age, and as she unwrapped it, the room dimmed. Inside was a journal, small, leather-bound, the kind a boy might keep under his bed. The name on the front was etched into the leather with something sharp, Jeremy Carrick. She opened it. The pages were filled with tiny, tight handwriting, each line pressed too close together as if written in secret in darkness. The words weren't memories. They were entries, desperate, incomplete thoughts. "It's in the walls. It watches through the cracks. No one believes me, not even when the birds stopped singing. I heard it breathing, last night, inside the chimney. I think I fed it. I don't know how to stop." Elsie flipped further. The last page was stained ink smeared from what might have been water, or tears, or worse. "If you're reading this, I'm still here. Please tell someone I tried." She looked up. Jeremy hadn't moved. "I didn't mean to," he said almost to himself. "I didn't know what it wanted. I just wanted it to stop." Elsie closed the journal gently. "You wrote it all down." "I had to. If I forgot, it would have become part of me. That's what it does. It waits for you to forget. And then it fills the gaps." She walked toward him and placed the journal in his hands. "You don't have to carry it anymore." He looked down at the journal. His hands trembled. "No one ever came before." "I did." The attic began to shift. Not collapse, breathe. The beams straightened. The dust lifted. Light returned in gentle pulses, illuminating the boxes. The old wallpaper peeled in strips behind the insulation. The floorboards worn by generations of forgotten footsteps. Jeremy stepped back toward the wall where he had stood for so long. "There were others here before me. Not many. Just enough to make it feel full." Elsie nodded. "I'm finding them, one by one." He smiled then, faint but real. "Tell them I wasn't angry," he said. The attic dimmed again, not into darkness, but into dusk. Jeremy faded slowly, like the light moving across the walls at sunset. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The notebook lay on her desk. Jeremy's name circled now, the journal entry she hadn't written sitting clearly beneath it. He fed it to survive. But he didn't let it feed on him. The photo beside the page was different now. Jeremy was still there, coat-slouched hands in pockets. But this time, he was smiling. Morning arrived slowly, with overcast light stretching across Elsie's floor like a gray veil. She rose without the weight that had followed her for so many years, without the invisible ache of something unfinished. Jeremy's story had closed like a book returned to its shelf. Not forgotten, just settled. The photograph remained on her desk, but the energy around it had changed. Before it had throbbed with the tension of something incomplete. Now it felt like a memory pressed into paper, full of truth, but no longer demanding. She spent the day, as she often did now, watching. Not for signs or omens, but for moments that might belong to someone else's unfinished echo. Her world had subtly reshaped itself. Places she passed had texture now. Certain buildings hummed. Certain stairwells pulled at her gaze. A rusted swing set. A sidewalk crack shaped like a crescent moon. a laundry line with one missing pin. They were cues, not yet stories, but waiting. And then at dusk, the call came. She didn't hear a phone, didn't receive a letter. She simply looked out her window as she often did when the city turned soft and gold, and saw a girl standing across the street staring up at her apartment. She was small, maybe 8. Hair pulled into 2 loose braids. She wore a cardigan too large for her sleeves, covering her hands. In one, she held a stuffed bear by the ear. In the other, a slip of paper. The light turned red behind her. Cars passed. People walked by. No one noticed her, except Elsie. She moved, down the stairs, through the door, across the street. When she reached the sidewalk, the girl didn't flinch, didn't blink. She held out the slip of paper with both hands. Elsie took it. There was only one sentence written in blocky, uneven letters. "They're still in the well." Elsie looked up, but the girl was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just empty sidewalk. She returned home and placed the paper on the desk beside the others. The handwriting was childlike, shaky, but forceful. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a message. She opened the notebook. New page, new name, but there was no name this time. Just a place, the well. She closed her eyes, let the quiet deepen. And there it was, the rope, frayed and damp in her hands, the smell of earth wet and deep, the echo of water dripping onto stone far below, a ring of crumbling bricks in the middle of a field overgrown with weeds, and a voice, not afraid, not calling for help, just repeating the same sentence calmly, like a child reciting a line in a school play. "They're still in the well. They're still in the well." She saw it clearly now. The well hadn't been sealed. It had been ignored. The dream came that night. She stood at the edge of it, the mouth of the well, yawning open in the grass like a wound. The stones were ancient, some moss-covered, others cracked. Wind whistled faintly from below, not because the well was deep, but because something inside was breathing through the cracks. She leaned over the edge, didn't fall, didn't speak. She listened. The voice returned, soft, plural. "We didn't climb down, we fell." Elsie whispered into the dark, "Who are you?" There was a long pause. Then the voice answered in perfect chorus, "We were left here." The dream shifted. She was inside the well now, not at the bottom, but on a ledge halfway down her back, pressed against slick stone, the damp clinging to her clothes. Across from her, carved into the opposite wall, were names. Hundreds, maybe more. All in different scripts, different hands. Some barely scratches, others deeply etched. Names long since worn down by time and water. But one stood out, Toby, and beneath it a smaller word, brother. She traced the letters with her hand. The stone was warm. Then a sudden flutter of sound fabric moving bare feet on rock, the splash of something just below. She looked down and saw them. 2 boys, maybe 7 or 8, one with a red shirt, one barefoot. Standing ankle-deep in waterheads, tilted upward, not pleading, not screaming, just watching her. Their faces were strange, not in deformity, but in stillness. The stillness of something that has stopped asking to be rescued. One of them lifted his hand and pointed behind her. She turned. Another ledge, another child, a girl, the one from the street. She held the bear now with both hands, the paper gone. "They forgot us," she said simply. So we stayed. Elsie wanted to speak. Ask what they needed, what they were waiting for. But the words caught in her throat, replaced by a single realization that bloomed like a weight in her chest. These weren't ghosts, not exactly. They were remains, not of bodies, of memories, cast aside, left to settle in places that no longer made space for the stories they held. Elsie stepped toward the girl. "You don't have to stay here." The girl looked up. Her eyes were dark but not empty. "We can't climb. It's too high." Then the voice returned from every wall of the well. "But if you carry us up, we'll follow." And with that, the water began to rise. Not flood, rise. Not to drown, but to lift. Elsie held out her hand. The water wasn't cold. That was the first thing Elsie noticed. It was cool, yes, but not the biting kind of cold you'd expect from the bottom of a well forgotten by time. It had a strange warmth to it, like it had been waiting just beneath the surface still and undisturbed, until someone remembered how to draw it upward. As it rose past her ankles, then her knees, she realized it didn't weigh her down. It lifted, gently, steadily, like being cradled in a dream, where gravity has forgotten its duty. The two boys below stepped closer, water brushing their chests now, and the girl with the bear stood without fear, her gaze fixed on Elsie, as though she already knew this moment had been promised. Elsie didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence of the place carried more meaning than any words could. She held out her hand to the girl again, who stepped forward and took it without hesitation. Her small fingers wrapped around Elsie's own, firm and steady. The boys moved beside them, their eyes fixed on the dark curve of the well above as the water continued to rise inch by patient inch. There was no rush, no panic, only ascent. The walls began to change as they floated upward. What had once been wet stone turned smooth and pale like marble left untouched for centuries. Names still covered them, etched in every corner, but now Elsie could read some clearly. Toby, Maria, Vincent, Lena. Each one seemed to glow faintly as the water passed, as if acknowledging the memory that had returned to them. Some were surrounded by symbols, childish drawings of stars, stick figures, even little animals scratched into the stone by hands that had once trembled with fear or hope. These weren't just names, they were imprints, stories sealed in stone when no one else had listened. As they neared the top, the light changed. It wasn't sunlight. It was softer, diffused like lanterns behind sheer fabric. The opening above no longer felt like an exit. It felt like a threshold. The water stopped just below the edge, and without prompting, the children began to step out one by one. The boys first climbing easily onto the grass beyond the well's rim, their bare feet leaving no prints. The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening briefly around Elsie's. "Will it stay open?" she asked. Elsie met her eyes. "I'll keep it open." The girl nodded once, then stepped lightly out of the water. She turned, placed the bear carefully at the edge of the well, and vanished into the field without looking back. Elsie climbed out last. She stood on solid ground again in the middle of a vast, overgrown field under a gray sky. The well behind her was silent. The stones no longer crumbled. They were whole now, though moss still lined the cracks as if memory had been restored, but not polished. She glanced around, but the children were gone, the field empty except for the breeze swaying tall grass in every direction. She turned back to the well and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." Then she opened her eyes. Back in her apartment, the notebook was open in her lap, the page labeled "The Well," now filled with names she hadn't written, scrawled in a dozen different hands and styles. In the corner, one small message had been added beneath it all. "We were only waiting for someone to remember our names." On the desk, beside the other tokens of her journey, a new object had appeared, a piece of twine, rough and frayed, tied in a knot. She didn't question how it had arrived. She only reached out, touched it, and felt the deep echo of water below stone, and the soft voices that no longer had to call out. Elsie leaned back in her chair, closed the notebook, and let the silence of the room hold her. She was no longer afraid of what waited behind the veil. These were not curses or hauntings. They were inheritances passed down not through blood, but through remembrance. She had become their keeper, and the stories, well, they weren't finished yet. Elsie awoke the next morning with a deep stillness in her chest, the kind that comes after a storm, not because the air is clear, but because you've survived something bigger than you were ready for. The apartment felt warmer, though the windows were closed and the sky outside was a dull gray. On her desk, The notebook remained untouched since the night before, yet the scent of earth and old water still lingered faintly in the air. The twine rested atop the page labeled "The Well," its fibers slightly damp, though her fingers were dry when she reached for it. She didn't try to explain these things anymore. They had become part of her routine, part of the language the unseen now used to speak with her. That morning, she walked with purpose. No work, no errands, just a quiet sense of direction she didn't question. The city, as always, moved around her, in its practiced rhythm, cars pulsing through intersections, people absorbed in their devices, the usual chatter at cafes and bus stops. But Elsie passed through it all like a thread, weaving through cloth unseen yet essential. Her steps carried her toward the outer edge of the neighborhood, past new buildings and hollow construction sites, until the familiar gave way to the forgotten. She reached a road she hadn't walked in years. It led toward the edge of a dry creek bed, where old houses long boarded up leaned into the wind with the tired weight of memory. One of them stood farther back from the others, hidden behind a wrought iron fence, so rusted it seemed to be growing from the soil. She paused in front of it, not because the house called to her, but because the air around it was quiet. Too quiet. The wind didn't blow here. The street sounds fell away. It was as though something held its breath. The gate creaked open without resistance. The yard was overgrown weeds pushing up through broken stone vines clawing at the siding. The front porch sagged, but the door was intact. She climbed the steps and placed her hand on the doorknob, feeling the cold of metal that hadn't been touched in years. It didn't surprise her when it turned without effort. Inside the house was frozen in a moment that didn't belong to any particular year. Wallpaper from the 70s, furniture from the 50s, dust from a century ago. Time had blurred here, folded in on itself. She moved through the living room slowly, her hand brushing over surfaces, not to clean them, but to acknowledge them. She wasn't looking for anything. Not yet. But something here had been waiting. She stopped at the base of the stairs. The air shifted, not colder, deeper, like the breath of the house had changed. She looked upward. The staircase curved to the left, disappearing around the bend. Light from a high window cast long shadows across the wall, and in the middle of one, she saw it the faint silhouette of a small figure, a child, standing still, watching. Elsie didn't speak. Instead, she ascended. Each step creaked, but the house didn't resist. It observed. At the top, the hallway was narrow-lined with 3 doors, all closed. She walked past the first and second, stopping in front of the third. Her hand hovered above the knob, and from the other side she heard a whisper so soft it was barely breath. "Help her." Elsie opened the door. The room was a child's bedroom, small, unremarkable. But someone had lived here, truly lived. Toys arranged carefully on shelves, a row of books leaning gently to one side, a worn rug shaped like a sunflower in the middle of the floor. On the far wall above the small bed was a framed picture of a girl and her mother, smiling, holding hands, eyes shining in the kind of way only people who don't know about loss can shine. But the bed was unmade, the sheets tangled, the pillow damp. At the foot of the bed sat a journal. Elsie approached it and sat gently, as if not to disturb the memory still folded into the fabric of the room. She opened the journal. The pages were filled with careful, looping handwriting. "Her name is Lila. She stopped talking after Dad left. Sometimes she stares into the closet for hours. Sometimes she whispers to it. I try to keep the door shut, but it always opens again." Elsie flipped ahead. "I think the closet isn't just a closet. I hear other voices now. I think they want to trade places." The final page read, "I went in, just for a second. I left the door open, in case someone remembers." The journal ended there. Elsie looked at the closet. It stood slightly ajar. The air around it pulsed, not with malevolence, but with pressure, like a door that had been held shut for too long, and now hung open, not because it had been forced, but because the thing behind it had finally grown tired of hiding. She rose and stepped toward it, not to banish anything, not to fight, but to listen, because somewhere Lila was still inside, and the story hadn't yet been told. The space behind the closet door wasn't a closet at all. Not anymore. It had the dimensions of one. Yes, the shallow depth, the narrow width. But the moment Elsie stepped past the threshold, everything changed. The light shifted. The air thickened. The wood beneath her feet stopped creaking, and instead gave way to silence, the kind so dense it seemed to press against her skin. She turned to glance behind her, but the doorway was gone. Or rather, it had become elsewhere a suggestion rather than a passage. Before her stretched a hallway impossibly long for any house lined with wallpaper, so pale it might have once been white, now yellowed to the color of brittle paper. Along each wall hung picture frames, some crooked, some cracked. None held photographs. Only blank parchment, or in some cases, faded silhouettes, like the memory of images long since erased. Elsie walked forward, her fingers brushing one of the frames. It was warm to the touch, almost alive. With each step, she noticed how the floor shifted slightly, like it didn't want to be walked on. It wasn't resistance, it was weariness. This place had been used over and over by others who came before. It held not malevolence, but exhaustion, like a story that had been told too many times without ever being understood. Then she heard the giggle, small, quick, echoing, from up ahead where the hallway turned to the right. It wasn't mocking or sinister. It was the unfiltered laugh of a child who didn't know she was lost. Elsie quickened her pace. At the corner she turned and saw her. A little girl, maybe 6, crouched on the floor drawing with chalk. The floor here had changed, no longer wood, but gray stone, like an old basement. The girl had brown curls, soft and uneven, and wore a yellow dress. Her bare feet were smudged with dust. She didn't look up as Elsie approached, still focused on her drawing, concentric circles layered in white, then blue, then white again. Over and over. "Lila," Elsie said softly. The girl paused. Her hand, still clutching a stub of chalk, trembled slightly. I don't remember who that is." "It's you," Elsie said, kneeling down. "Your sister wrote about you in her journal." At that, the girl looked up. Her eyes were hazel, but too dark around the edges, as if shadowed by too much time in places without sun. "My sister," Elsie nodded. "She left the door open, for you." The girl stared at her for a long time. Then she pointed at the wall behind them. Elsie turned. There was another door, not like the one she'd come through. This one was rounded at the top, old wood, bound with iron straps sunken into the wall as though it had been built and forgotten in the same moment. It pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of something buried. Carved above it in delicate looping script was one word: trade. "I didn't want to," the girl whispered behind her. "They said I could go if I let one of them out. But I didn't want to. I just wanted my sister." Elsie stepped toward the door. "Did you open it?" Lila nodded barely. "Only a little, just enough to hear." "And did anything come out?" She didn't answer. Instead, the door creaked on its own. Just a sliver. The darkness behind it wasn't empty. It was reflective, like oil or glass or the surface of a deep, unmoving pond. Elsie stared into it, and her own face stared back. But it wasn't right. Her eyes were too wide. Her mouth didn't move with hers. It was a version of herself, stuck as though left behind in some forgotten reflection. The voice came from that reflection not with sound, but with memory. We only needed someone to look away. Elsie backed up slowly. Lila clutched her chalk tightly now, as if it were a charm. "I didn't let them out," she said, "but I think I left me in." Elsie understood. This place didn't trap children by chains or force. It tricked them into forgetting which side of the door they belonged on. And Lila, too small, too scared, had wandered too far into a space that offered something familiar, something comforting her sister's voice, perhaps repeated back to her in subtle mimicry. Elsie turned to the girl. "You're not forgotten. She wrote everything. That means you're still real." Lila looked down at her drawing. "They said I'm a copy now, that I left the real me behind." "No," Elsie said firmly. "They want you to believe that. That's how they stay here. You're still you. You've just been listening to them too long." The drawing began to glow faintly. Circles inside circles, a door in chalk. Elsie understood. She took the girl's hand. "Draw the way back." Lila hesitated, then nodded. With slow, careful lines, she completed the outermost ring. The moment the circle closed, the air around them shifted. The hallway dimmed, the floor smoothed. The reflection behind the trade door cracked like thin ice. Elsie felt the pull gentle but real. They were being remembered. The chalk circle pulsed once and light poured out of it. "Step in," Elsie said. Lila stared at her, still uncertain. "Will they follow?" "No," Elsie whispered. "They only live in forgotten places. You've been found." The girl stepped into the circle. The light enveloped them both. When Elsie opened her eyes, she was back in the bedroom. The closet was just a closet again, the door wide open. Daylight filled the room. On the bed, the journal lay closed, and in the hallway outside, a woman's voice called out faintly, "Lila, are you ready to go?" Tiny footsteps hurried past the doorway, and Elsie saw the girl no longer pale, no longer faded, rush into her mother's arms. She smiled. The door shut gently behind them. Elsie picked up the journal and placed it in her bag, and when she returned to her apartment, the name was already written in her notebook. Lila. She didn't trade. She waited. By the time the sun set that evening, Elsie had lit her candle, opened her notebook, and placed the journal from Lila's room beside the others on her desk. It sat there like a puzzle piece, finally returned to its box, its edges worn, its pages still smelling faintly of childhood and hidden fear. She read through it again, slower this time, absorbing not just the words, but the quiet between them. The silences where questions were never asked. The short, clipped sentences where something too large for a child's vocabulary had been forced into small, manageable thoughts. There was power in the simplicity of it. Power in being seen. Outside, the wind had picked up. It wasn't unusual. But tonight, it didn't sound like movement. It sounded like sifting, as if something old was being stirred. The stories weren't slowing down. If anything, they were gathering. Elsie had expected a kind of pause after each one, a sense of closure, of rest, but they weren't lined up like books on a shelf. They overlapped. They tangled. One memory called out to the next. She felt it more clearly now than ever before. The stories had found each other, and they were using her to find their ends. That night she dreamed of a train, not a modern one, not metallic and sharp with lights, but an old wooden passenger train, the kind that creaked and hissed and moved, like it was never quite certain it would reach its destination. She stood on the platform as it approached, its front headlamp flickering weakly. When it stopped, the doors didn't open. Not at first. She walked alongside it, peering into the windows. Inside, the compartments were dim, full of shadows, and in each one, a child sat alone. No movement, no sound, just waiting. Some stared at their knees, some out the windows, some directly at her. Then one compartment door slid open. Inside sat a boy with blonde hair, no older than 10. He wore a collared shirt and suspenders, his shoes slightly scuffed. On the seat beside him rested a lunchbox, one of those old tin ones painted with faded circus animals. He looked up at her with the tired gaze of someone who had waited too long for someone who never came. Elsie stepped inside. "May I sit?" The boy shrugged. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked at her and his lips moved, but no sound came. He frowned, then tried again. Nothing. Instead, he picked up the lunchbox and opened it. Inside was a folded slip of paper. He handed it to her. It read, "Don't forget me when the tunnel comes." She looked up. The tunnel. The train shuddered. Outside the window, the landscape began to change, rolling fields swallowed by fog, then stone walls rising on both sides. The sky narrowed into blackness. They were entering the tunnel. The lights flickered. The boy clutched the lunchbox tighter, eyes wide. Elsie leaned forward. "What happens in the tunnel?" His hand shook. He pressed his finger against the word "forget" on the note, and she understood. The tunnel wasn't a place. It was a moment, a passage, where people were forgotten, where memories slipped out of reach, where the lost stayed lost. Elsie grabbed his hand. "I won't forget you." The train groaned. Lights dimmed to a faint glow. All around her, the other compartments flickered. Children slowly fading, not vanishing, but thinning like dust caught in moonlight. The boy's eyes welled up. His mouth moved again, soundless, but this time Elsie could feel the name. Not hear it, feel it. "Arthur." She repeated it aloud. "Arthur." The lights flared. The train lurched, and the compartment was empty. She was alone. When she opened her eyes, the candle had burned low, the smell of smoke curling toward the ceiling. Her notebook lay open to a new page. The name Arthur had been written neatly at the top, her own handwriting, but not from her own hand. Below it, a sentence had formed in dark ink, as if freshly written. "The tunnel only takes what we let it." Beside the notebook sat something unfamiliar. A tin lunchbox, old and dented, painted with faded circus animals. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded slip of paper, blank, except for the faint impression of a sentence once pressed there, now barely visible beneath the light. She didn't need to read it. She remembered. Elsie spent the following day in quiet reflection, not from fatigue, but from necessity. The stories were beginning to change her, not just in the way she saw the world, but in the way the world responded to her. People hesitated longer when speaking to her, as if sensing something behind her eyes. Strangers sometimes paused mid-sentence, looking at her with a vague recognition they couldn't place. Children stared longer than they should, their eyes unblinking, as though she carried something they remembered from a dream they couldn't explain. And maybe she did. She left the lunchbox untouched. It sat on her desk like a sealed promise, its presence enough to keep the thread intact. She didn't need to open it again. Arthur's name was written now, his story rooted. That was all the tunnel required remembrance. That evening, as the wind began to rise, she walked. The streets were emptying lights flicking on behind windows as families settled in for the night. She passed through neighborhoods, old and new, watching the city breathe in its subtle ways. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of a public park she hadn't visited in years. The trees here were older, thicker. They leaned in strange directions, their trunks gnarled like frozen muscles, their branches tangled as if trying to reach one another. Beyond the last of the streetlights, she saw something glinting beneath the dirt path glass. She knelt. It was a marble. Faded blue, cloudy at the center. The kind children played with long ago, back when toys didn't need screens and imagination filled in every missing detail. She picked it up. It was warm in her hand. The wind stilled. Then from somewhere behind the trees a voice drifted in soft, tuneless, almost like humming. A lullaby, maybe, or a song sung only halfway, the rest lost to time. She followed. The park sloped downward into a wooded area rarely visited after dark. There were no lamps here, only the silver spill of moonlight through trembling leaves. The sound grew louder. Not humming, not singing, a skipping rope. She heard it before she saw her, a girl in a tattered white dress, long hair tied with a ribbon, skipping alone on a patch of stone near an old maintenance shed. The rope slapped the ground in rhythm. her feet landing lightly, the chant in her voice slow and eerie. One for the father, one for the bone, one for the child who never came home. Elsie stepped into the clearing. The girl stopped mid-skip, the rope stilled in her hands. She didn't look frightened, just paused, like she had been expecting company for a long time and was unsure if Elsie was the right guest. "You know the rhyme?" the girl asked. "No," Elsie said, "but I think I'm supposed to hear it." The girl studied her for a long time. Then, with a sigh, she sat cross-legged on the stone. Her skipping rope coiled beside her like a serpent at rest. "They changed it," the girl said, running her finger over a crack in the ground. "It used to end with a name, but they forgot it. So now it just stops." Elsie knelt. "Do you remember it?" The girl shook her head. "No one does. That's why I'm still skipping. I was supposed to stop when the name was spoken, but no one ever says it." Elsie reached into her pocket, the marble still clutched in her palm. "Is this yours?" The girl's eyes widened. She held out her hand. Elsie placed the marble gently into her palm. The moment it touched her skin, the clearing changed. The wind stilled. The trees quieted. The ground beneath them shimmered briefly like heat over asphalt. The girl smiled faintly. "It was mine. It rolled away during recess. I chased it into the trees, and I couldn't find the way back." She stared down at the marble now glowing softly in the moonlight. "I waited. I counted days in my head, but the days stopped coming, so I counted skips instead." Her eyes lifted. "I don't know my name." Elsie opened her notebook and flipped to a new page. "No one's given you one since—" "No." Elsie thought for a moment. Then she wrote. She waited for her name to be the last word in the rhyme. The skipping rope unraveled on its own, curling gently into a circle. "Maybe it was Sophie," Elsie said. The girl's breath caught. Her fingers clenched the marble. "Yes," she whispered. "That feels right." Elsie wrote it. Sophie. The rope lifted, coiling upward into the air like smoke. The trees rustled gently as though bowing, and the girl Sophie stood. "Can I stop now?" she asked. Elsie nodded. "You can stop." Sophie stepped backward, her feet light the marble glowing between her hands. "One for the father, one for the bone, one for the child who now goes home." And just like that, she was gone. No fade, no shimmer, just absence. Elsie closed the notebook. The rope fell to the ground inert, and somewhere behind the trees the wind carried a voice that had been waiting far too long to sing its name. Elsie didn't walk home that night. She drifted each step lighter than the last, as if something inside her had been untied. The notebook in her bag felt heavier than before, though not in a burdensome way. It was weighty the way old stones are shaped, not by force, but by the gentle wear of time. The name Sophie had settled onto the page like dew, her story brief, but whole. Some stories were like that, not long, not tangled with tragedy, or riddled with shadows, just waiting. Waiting for someone to find the missing word. Waiting for someone to speak the rhyme to its rightful end. Back in her apartment, Elsie placed the skipping rope beside the marble on her desk. Two objects ordinary in any other world, but now humming with something more. She didn't light the candle that night. She didn't need to. The air in the room was still not in a lifeless way, but like the house itself was listening. She sat beside the window and let her mind go blank, trusting that if another story was waiting, it would find her. And it did. It arrived the next morning not as a dream, but as a package left outside her door. Brown paper tied with twine, no return address. She brought it inside, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a single item, a VHS tape, the kind long since forgotten by most households, its plastic casing scratched but intact. A faded white label along the edge read one word in smudged black ink: Natalie. She didn't own a VCR, but she knew who did. That afternoon, she visited a second-hand electronics shop in a part of town she rarely ventured into. The place smelled of old wires and forgotten heat shelves, lined with obsolete devices humming gently like retired sentinels. The man behind the counter was older with soft eyes and the kind of voice that didn't ask questions. When she placed the tape on the counter and asked to view it, he simply nodded and guided her to a small back room where an old television sat atop a rolling cart. He inserted the tape, pressed play, and left her alone. The screen crackled, static, then grainy footage, a child's bedroom, pink walls, stuffed animals arranged neatly on a shelf, a vanity mirror with stickers peeling at the edges. The camera was shaky handheld. Someone behind it laughed, a man, warm-voiced, mid-30s. "Say hi, Natalie." A little girl appeared in the frame, maybe 7, light brown hair and pigtails, missing a front tooth. She waved shyly. "Hi, Daddy." The scene cut. Now the girl was sitting on her bed talking to someone off camera. "She's my best friend," Natalie said. "Who is the man?" asked. "The girl in the mirror." There was a pause. "The one in your reflection?" he asked, trying to keep it light. Natalie shook her head. "No, the one behind it." Static flared. Next scene. Nighttime. The camera, still handheld, walked down the hallway of the house. Quiet. Then into the girl's room. The mirror was uncovered. A faint hum came from the screen, like a low-frequency buzz, just under the surface. Then barely something moved in the mirror. The man behind the camera gasped, dropped it. The screen tilted, fell sideways, the view skewed at an angle. A shadow passed across the mirror, and then the tape ended. The screen went black. Elsie sat in silence for a long time. When she returned to the counter, the man said nothing, only nodded as if he'd known she'd come in eventually. Back at home, she opened her notebook. The name Natalie was already waiting on the next page. She stared at it. The girl in the mirror. Not a reflection. Not a trick of the mind. A presence behind the glass. Elsie placed a hand on her own bathroom mirror that evening, fingers against cool glass. Her reflection stared back, unflinching. "I'm not here to trap you," she whispered. The mirror stayed silent. But in the corner of the glass, just at the edge of the silvered backing, a small shape began to form. A girl, watching, still, waiting. Elsie didn't flinch. She just said the name out loud. "Natalie." The lights flickered. The air shifted. And the mirror remembered. The mirror stayed quiet for a long moment after Elsie spoke the name. No movement, no flicker. Just her reflection staring back with that subtle stillness she had come to recognize as attention. The thing behind the glass wasn't watching out of malice, it was listening. Mirrors, after all, were never meant to reflect light. They were meant to catch memory. And this one was full. Elsie didn't look away. "Natalie," she said again, this time softer. I saw the tape. The bathroom light above her hummed, once dimmed slightly, then steadied. Her reflection blinked, but only once, and just a beat behind her own. Something was wrong with the glass. Not the surface, the depth. As if someone had added another inch of thickness behind the silver, and something was pressing gently from the other side. The shape of a forehead, a fingertip, a breath. She leaned closer, and in that extra dimension of depth, she saw a girl's silhouette. Still, waiting, facing inward. "Natalie," she whispered. "You said the girl in the mirror was your best friend. Was that you? Or someone else?" The shape in the glass didn't respond, but the light warped subtly, as though the mirror had dipped inward. And then very faintly, letters began to appear on the surface. Not etched, not fogged, just implied, beneath the surface. "I didn't know." Elsie's breath caught. "You didn't know what?" More words slowly forming. "She asked me to switch, just for a day." Elsie's voice dropped, trembling now. "And you did." "She said she was lonely." The reflection flickered. And then for a single heartbeat, the girl behind the glass was there, clear, vivid. Pigtails, pale skin, a frilly collar, eyes wide with something like longing. Her mouth moved, but she didn't switch back. The mirror shimmered again, the image unstable. Elsie reached out, pressing her fingertips lightly to the glass. She could feel a faint warmth beneath it, pulsing like the heartbeat of a memory that had been trapped for too long. "I can help," she said, "but I need to know who she was." The girl's image stilled. Her mouth opened again, slowly. She mouthed a name. Elsie couldn't hear it, could barely read it. Emily. The mirror rippled like water. And then, in a flicker of movement so fast she almost didn't see it, a second face appeared beside Natalie's. Slightly older, eyes darker, smile too wide. Emily. The real one, or the other one. Natalie's shape began to dim, shrinking back into the mirror's depth, her eyes now wide with panic. The letters reformed. "She's coming. Don't believe her." The bathroom light surged, went out. The mirror went black. Elsie stepped back into darkness, her pulse thrumming loud in her ears. She didn't move, didn't run. Instead, she walked calmly into her bedroom, lit the candle on her desk, and opened the notebook. On the page already labeled Natalie, she wrote one more name underneath in heavy ink. Emily, the other one. She stared at it for a long moment. If Natalie had agreed to switch even for a day, and that day never ended, then somewhere along the way, Emily had taken her place not just in mirrors, but in memory. And no one had noticed. No one but Natalie. She reached for the tape again, ran her fingers over the edges, now feeling something she hadn't noticed before, a slight crack along the label, as if it had been pried open once before and sealed again. She turned it in her hands and saw tucked just beneath the plastic edge a corner of paper. She teased it out carefully. A child's drawing, crayons, pink and green and red. Two girls standing side by side. One smiling, one with her face scribbled over. A single sentence at the bottom in large, careful handwriting. "Only one of us can be real." Elsie turned the drawing over. One word, switch. She didn't sleep that night. She sat beside the mirror watching, waiting. Not for Natalie, for Emily. The candle burned low, casting long amber fingers across the wall, flickering just enough to make the corners of Elsie's apartment feel too deep. Shadows stretched where they shouldn't, and the mirror reflected more than it received. She sat opposite it, cross-legged on the floor, the notebook resting open beside her. The page titled Natalie now waited with the gravity of a second name. Emily, the other one. And though nothing had moved for hours, Elsie could feel a shift in the air as though something had taken notice. The mirror didn't shimmer. It didn't crack. It simply watched. Elsie had learned by now that the truly dangerous things didn't arrive with screams or sudden gusts of wind. They came softly the way sleep does, the way forgetting creeps in. And she suspected Emily was one of those. Not a monster in the traditional sense, but a shadow that grew stronger the longer it remained misremembered. She didn't speak. She'd already said too much the night before. This time she waited. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the mirror clouded. It wasn't steam. It wasn't fog. It was memory. And it spread from the center outward, like something inside the glass had exhaled. A faint tapping followed 1, 2, 3 slow knocks from the other side. Then a face began to form. Not Natalie, not entirely. This one had sharper cheekbones, eyes that smiled, even when the mouth didn't. And though the features were close enough to Natalie's to be mistaken at first glance, Elsie saw it now. The difference wasn't physical. It was intent. Emily didn't look back at her with fear or hope. She looked back like someone testing a mirror for cracks, waiting to see if it would break under pressure. "You're not Natalie," Elsie said. The face grinned. "No," it mouthed. "But you know that now." Elsie nodded. "You switched places, and you never left." The girl behind the glass tilted her head, mock confusion. Her lips moved again. "She asked me to." The image shifted Emily sitting on a bed, Natalie's bed, holding a bear, watching herself in the mirror. She looked small, normal. But even through the grain of memory, her stillness felt unnatural, like she was performing being human. Elsie whispered, "And where is Natalie now?" Emily's expression darkened. A shadow moved behind her in the glass, deep swirling the hint of a room that didn't exist anymore. Then, with a slight nod toward the lower left corner of the mirror, the glass rippled again, revealing a box. A toy chest. Closed. Wrapped in soft pink ribbon. "She's in there," Elsie asked. Emily pressed her palm to the glass. Elsie mirrored her. The moment their hands aligned, pain surged behind Elsie's eyes, not sharp, but familiar, like a forgotten bruise. Her vision blurred, and then she saw it not through the mirror, but from inside the memory itself. Natalie, small and silent, curled in a toy chest too tight for her limbs, her hands pressed to the lid, her mouth forming the word, "please," not screaming, just asking. Behind her, toys lined the chest like guardians turned indifferent. Dolls with cracked porcelain smiles. A jack-in-the-box frozen mid-song. Everything too still. Emily's voice whispered into her mind, not through ears, but like a secret passed directly into thought. She stopped asking after the first year. Elsie tore her hand away from the mirror. The reflection didn't fade. Emily leaned in her face close to the glass. She left the door open. I walked through, and nobody noticed. Not even her father. Elsie's breath caught. "He filmed you." Emily smirked. "He thought I was her. And when he started to see the difference, it was too late. You saw the tape. He dropped the camera. You scared him. I showed him the truth." Elsie clenched her fists. "You're not supposed to be here." Emily shrugged. "Neither is she." With that, the mirror's surface began to pulse. Faint whispers emerged, not voices, but overlapping thoughts, memories, doubts. The kind that make a child question if what they see is real or just their mind playing games. And in those whispers, Elsie heard the seed of Emily's power uncertainty. She had grown in the silence of disbelief. Elsie steadied herself. She picked up the drawing Natalie had left, the crayon image of two girls, one scribbled out. She held it up to the mirror. "You were never meant to stay," she said. "You were supposed to go back." Emily's smile faltered. Elsie stepped forward, placing the drawing flat against the mirror's surface. But now she remembers. And so do I. The drawing began to glow faintly. Crayon lines pulsing like they were alive. From deep inside the glass, the image of the toy chest returned, ribbons unraveling, the lid lifting on its own. And Natalie? Sitting up, eyes wide, breathing. Elsie whispered, "Come back." The mirror cracked, just once down the center. Emily's face twisted, not in pain, but in panic. She reached for the crack, trying to seal it, but her hands passed through like smoke. Natalie climbed out of the toy chest, her limbs trembling, but her face resolute. She walked forward in the reflection toward Emily, toward the crack. Elsie watched, holding her breath, and then Natalie pushed. From behind, Emily fell, not out of the mirror, into it, and the glass sealed. Natalie stood now alone in the reflection. She raised her hand. Elsie matched it. "You're safe," she said. "It's over." Natalie nodded once. The mirror went clear. Just a mirror again. Back at her desk, Elsie opened the notebook. Beneath Natalie, she wrote the final line. She remembered herself before anyone else did, and that was enough. The candle burned steady beside her. The house was quiet again, and behind the mirror, no one waited. The days that followed felt like the hush after a storm. Not the peaceful kind, but the fragile silence when everything is still standing, yet nothing feels quite the same. Elsie found herself moving slower through the world, not because she was tired, but because the air around her had changed. Lighter, maybe, or heavier. It was difficult to say. The mirror remained calm, unremarkable, no longer a passage or a prison, just a piece of glass. But she didn't trust it. Not entirely. She had learned that the places between things, between reflections, between thoughts, between memories, were where the strange ones lived. The notebook was nearly full now. Dozens of names, each with their own story carved beneath. Grace, Margot, Clara, Jeremy, Lila, Arthur, Sophie, Natalie. A list of children not lost but once forgotten, now remembered. And in their remembrance, the world shifted slightly, became more whole. But even as she read over their names, Elsie felt something underneath them, a pattern she couldn't yet decipher. A hum in the lines between stories. That hum took shape in a dream that began like all the others, vague, colorless, built of sound more than sight. A wind chime, a dripping faucet, footsteps on linoleum. But then came the image, a stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. She saw her own hand grasping a railing, cold, slick, metallic. Each step she descended deepened the silence. Not emptiness, suppression, like the world itself was holding its breath. At the bottom of the stairs, a hallway stretched out, hospital-white, windowless. Fluorescent lights buzzed above some flickering others, completely dead. She walked. At the far end, a single door waited. Not locked, just closed. She opened it. Inside was a playroom. Walls painted with faded murals of animals. A rocking horse. An old television on a wheeled cart. A shelf of books no longer read. In the center of the room, 3 chairs stood in a circle. 2 were occupied. The first child was drawing. The second stared at the wall, blinking slowly. The third chair was empty. Elsie stepped toward it and sat. Neither child looked at her. The one drawing, curly-haired, maybe 8 years old, continued without pause. Crayon to paper, loops and spirals. When she finished, she slid the paper across the floor toward Elsie. She picked it up. It was a map of a house. But not her house. Not one she recognized. Still something about the layout. Its crooked hallways, the double-doored closets, the staircase leading down to nowhere, felt achingly familiar. Like a place she'd seen in a story once then forgotten. The second child finally turned. His eyes were empty, not blank, but erased. Like someone had carefully removed the color of memory from them. He opened his mouth, but instead of words, he exhaled a small puff of dust. Then the room trembled. The lights flickered, and in the far corner a fourth child appeared. Not sitting, standing, his face obscured by a hood body still. But Elsie could feel his gaze. And though she had never seen him before, she knew. This was the one who didn't belong. The drawing child looked up and whispered, "He doesn't have a name." That's how he moves between stories. Elsie's throat tightened. The boy in the hood stepped forward. The other children didn't react, as if they couldn't see him, or refused to. Elsie stood. He stopped. Even in the silence, she could hear it, his breath. Hollow, rehearsed, like something pretending to breathe. She looked down at the map again. In the bottom corner, scrawled in tiny letters, was a phrase, "Don't let him in." She folded the drawing, placed it into her pocket. Then she looked up. The boy in the hood was closer now. She opened her mouth to ask his name, and woke up, gasping. The notebook was open beside her. The map from her dream sat on top of it. She hadn't drawn it, but it was real, still creased where she'd folded it. And beneath it, one sentence had been added in fresh ink below all the other stories. "There's one more, and he's watching." Elsie stared at the map for a long time, after waking her fingers tracing the lines of the house she didn't recognize, yet somehow knew. Each hallway, each staircase, each narrow corner that led to nowhere. It wasn't a structure of wood and stone. It was a memory, architectural and shifting. The kind of place dreams remembered before waking could steal them away. And on that map, the small warning in the corner continued to whisper louder with each passing minute. "Don't let him in." She tucked the drawing into the back of her notebook, careful not to smudge the faded lines, and stepped away from her desk. The apartment, as always, was quiet, but now it felt too still, as if something were holding its breath inside the walls. She checked her mirror. Nothing moved. The skipping rope and lunchbox remained untouched. The candle had burned itself out overnight, leaving only the curled edge of wax, and yet the silence persisted, not empty, but attentive. There was no question what she had to do. The map had shown her a house, a place, real or remembered. She didn't know which yet, but she knew the shape. Knew it in the marrow of her bones, the way you know the tune of a lullaby long after forgetting the words. She began walking that morning with no destination in mind, only a rhythm in her steps that matched the sketch of the halls drawn in crayon. She passed shops, parks, rows of houses with porches overgrown by vines. Then at the corner of a street she didn't recognize by name, but did by feel she saw it. A house that shouldn't exist, 2 stories, faded green siding, a roof sloping at the wrong angle, the windows dark, covered, not boarded, just ignored by the light, and the porch, its floor sagging slightly, as though the house leaned forward to listen, was exactly as the map had shown. Elsie stood at the gate. Something about the air around it felt folded, like stepping inside would bend more than distance. But she didn't hesitate. She had learned by now that the only way out of a haunting was through it. The front door creaked open before she touched it. Inside, the air was colder not from weather, but from disuse. The smell of old wallpaper and dry rot. Dust in layers so thick it muffled sound. She walked carefully. Each step echoed through memories that didn't belong to her. The floor plan matched the map exactly. She passed the double-doored closet, the cracked tile near the kitchen threshold, the staircase that spiraled downward into a basement wrapped in shadow. As she descended, the light faded, swallowed by a quiet so deep it made her ears ring. The playroom was there, just as she'd seen it. Same murals, same rocking horse, same wheeled television. The chairs had returned to their positions. 2 occupied, 1 empty. And in the corner, the 4th child, the hooded boy. He didn't move as she entered, didn't breathe. Just stood the black space beneath his hood, absorbing light that wasn't even there. She stepped closer. "I know what you are now," she said, her voice steady. "You're not one of them." Silence. "You don't want to be remembered. You want to stay in the forgotten places, because that's where you can pretend to belong." The boy tilted his head. Something in the room shifted. Not physically, perceptually. The walls seemed farther now, the light more distant, the space more loose, as if reality were relaxing its grip. Elsie stepped toward the children. The girl, drawing, turned slowly toward her. "He tells us stories," she whispered. "He tells us we were never real. That's why we stay." Elsie knelt, heart pounding. "He's wrong. I remember you. All of you. I've written your names." She opened her notebook. Pages fluttered. Names whispered into the stale air. The lights flickered weak but present. The boy in the hood stepped forward. "No name," he said. His voice cracked like ice. No shape, just the echo. Elsie stood between him and the children. "You've worn their names to hide your own. But someone's always watching now." She turned the notebook to a blank page, wrote 1 word. "Echo." The boy froze. "I see you now," she whispered. "And you can't stay where you've been seen." The playroom trembled. A wind rose from nowhere, rattling the chairs, lifting dust from the carpet in spirals. The rocking horse tipped. The TV rolled forward and crashed. And still, Elsie didn't move. She tore the page from the notebook, held it up. "You can't keep them," she said. "You're not the story anymore." The wind died instantly. The boy collapsed inward, not vanishing, but unraveling. His form, folded, twisted, became less, until the space he occupied no longer seemed like a space at all. Just a thin crease in the room, a corner of memory that refused to settle. And then he was gone. The children sat up, their eyes no longer hollow. The drawing girl reached out and touched Elsie's hand. "You said our names." Elsie nodded. "And I'll keep saying them." The light overhead hummed back to life. Color returned to the walls. And for the first time, the playroom felt like a place meant for children. She helped them stand, led them out of the basement. One by one, they faded into the warmth of the day outside. Elsie remained, notebook in hand, and on the final page beneath the name Echo, she wrote, "He told their stories to erase them. I tell them to remember. Elsie returned home with the afternoon sun dipping low behind the rooftops, casting long golden shadows that stretched across her apartment floor, like the quiet arms of memory. The house on the corner of the unnamed street Echo's house was behind her now, but its presence lingered not as a weight, but as a hush. A final note that still rang even after the music had stopped. She placed the notebook on the table. It looked different now, thicker, heavier, as if each story written within it had added more than ink. It radiated something steady, like heat from a stone that had absorbed years of sun. She ran her fingers along its edge and felt them tingle. The pages were full, not just with names, but with presence. Each line held a voice, each sentence an anchor. These children, these souls who had lingered in silence, were no longer trapped. They were remembered, rooted, named. And naming, Elsie had learned, was the first act of healing. She didn't light a candle this time. There was no need. The silence in her home wasn't watching anymore. It was resting, and yet something tugged at her thoughts. Not the boy in the hood. Echo was gone, unwritten from the stories he had tried to erase. But deeper still, beyond all she had seen, there was one more whisper, one more name she hadn't uncovered, not because it had been hidden, but because it had been closest. She turned back to the first page of the notebook. The very first name, her own. She had scribbled it there weeks ago in the margin just to mark it as hers. Elsie Lane. It sat there quiet, unassuming, but now she stared at it as if reading it for the first time. A soft chill passed down her spine. She flipped through the pages again. Grace, Jeremy, Lila, Natalie, Arthur, Sophie, Emily, Echo, and Elsie. Not above the stories, not beside them, among them. The candle flickered once, but she hadn't lit it. She turned slowly and saw herself in the mirror, only it wasn't her reflection. It looked like her, yes. Same face, same posture, same shirt. But the reflection's eyes were calm. Hers were trembling. She stepped closer. The mirror version tilted its head slightly, then mouthed something. She leaned in, whispering aloud. What? The image whispered back. You've always known. The notebook behind her fluttered open on its own, back to a blank page that hadn't existed seconds before. On it a new heading appeared, written in her own handwriting. The girl who listened. Beneath it, words began to shape, inked by an invisible hand. She heard stories not because they were spoken, but because they needed someone to hear them. And in hearing, she became part of them. Elsie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the mirror again. The other her didn't smile, didn't blink. She just watched, because the stories didn't just find her. They had always been hers. She wasn't just the listener. She was the link, the space between the lost and the living. The house, the mirror, the map, the tunnel, the skipping rope, the lunchbox, the drawing, all of them had passed through her. And now one last thing waited to be written. Elsie picked up the pen, and on that blank page beneath the girl who listened, she wrote, I remember all of you, and when I forget myself, you will remember me. The mirror shimmered once and smiled. The following morning dawned unusually still, as if the entire city had paused to inhale and hadn't yet exhaled. Elsie awoke without the jolt of dreams, without the residue of forgotten footsteps trailing through her thoughts. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar peace, not the absence of fear she had learned too well, that fear never truly disappeared, but the presence of completion, a quiet, gentle closing of something vast and ancient. She spent the early hours sitting beside the window notebook in her lap, the final pages softly fluttering in the breeze from the cracked window pane. Each name she'd written called to her now, not with pain, but with the hum of gratitude. They were not echoes anymore. They were real, returned. Hers only because they had passed through her, not because they were hers to keep. And yet the house still felt incomplete. She moved slowly through the rooms, stopping in front of each mirror. The bathroom, the hallway, the dusty old frame in the corner of the living room. Each one showed her reflection, nothing strange, nothing lingering, until she reached the smallest mirror in her bedroom, the one with the crack in the corner from when she had dropped it years ago. It was the only mirror she hadn't dared to use during any of the stories. Too personal, too close. And as she stood before it now, something inside her tightened, because this mirror didn't reflect just her face. It reflected where she'd been. Behind her in the mirror's image, shadows of places flickered. The tunnel, the closet, the staircase, the hallway of blank frames, the chair in the playroom, all there layered like film negatives over her shoulders. And in the center of it all, a door. It had no knob, no frame, just a narrow slit of darkness in the middle of the mirrored space like a scar. As she watched the slit widen slightly, not opening, just inviting, Elsie stepped back and the mirror stilled. The slit disappeared. But now she knew there was one more threshold, one more passage, not into someone else's story, but into her own. She turned to her desk. The notebook was open again. A new page had begun, but this time there was no name at the top, only a single line. The story doesn't end when the telling stops, and underneath it, to leave the door open is not a mistake. It's a promise. Elsie sat down. The candle unused since the last exorcism of Echo flared gently to life without a match. She dipped her pen into the ink, not to write a name, not to record a haunting, but to begin her story. Because while she had been the listener all this time, someone else would need to listen next. The cycle she understood now wasn't a curse. It was a calling. She started with a simple sentence. Tonight I write not what I remember, but what I have become. And the candle flame danced in agreement. Outside the wind picked up, not menacing, just enough to rattle the window. A reminder that some stories wait for the right voice, and hers was finally ready. That night, the sky pressed close over the city, its clouds so low and dense they seemed to rest on the rooftops. A stillness clung to the streets, like mist muting the usual hum of distant traffic and chatter. It was the kind of silence that made the world feel hollowed out, waiting for something to fill it. Inside her apartment, Elsie moved with a sense of ritual. She had prepared tea chamomile, with a dash of honey poured carefully into the mug with the chip on the rim. The candle on her desk was lit, its glow warm and unwavering, casting soft, familiar shadows across the notebook. But she hadn't written since that morning. Instead, she had been listening. Not for voices or footsteps or the scrape of something from behind the walls, but for what lay beneath all of it, the rhythm of her own story settling into place. Because for the first time there was no one else to wait for. No haunted child, no forgotten name, no shadow pretending to be a friend. Just her, the listener, the keeper, the one who had been drawn to the stories not out of curiosity, but because something inside her had always known she was part of them. The mirror in the bedroom remained unchanged. No flicker, no face. But the memory of the doorway lingered behind its glass. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was an invitation. She approached it slowly. Her reflection met her gaze without delay. No delay, no second-guessing, a perfect match. But as she stood there, something began to shift. Not in the mirror. In her. She saw herself differently now. Not the tired girl who once stared into the alley at the end of her street. Not the cautious soul who feared what might happen if she stepped too close to a memory that wasn't hers. This time, she saw someone whole. Worn, yes, but forged by the quiet weight of all those whispered truths. The mirror responded not with movement, but with light. Faint silver like moonlight through fog, and behind her reflection, the slit of the dark door opened again. Wider, a breath of cold air spilled out, not cruel, just ancient. Like the exhale of time itself, she reached out not with fear but acceptance. Her fingertips met the surface and the glass gave way, not like breaking, like dissolving, and through that slit she saw them, all of them. Children and shadows and rooms and roads, memories she'd carried, memories that had carried her. They stood on the other side, not trapped, not lost, just watching, waiting, because even when a story ends, something lingers. The feeling it gave, the truth it uncovered. Elsie stepped back from the mirror and let it close. She didn't need to walk through. She already had. The threshold wasn't in the glass. It was in her, and she was no longer afraid. Later that night, long after the candle had burned itself down and the tea had gone cold, she returned to her desk. The notebook was open again, the page she'd begun that morning still unfinished. She picked up the pen and wrote the last line. I was never haunted. I was chosen. Then she closed the book, not in dismissal, but in completion. Morning came, not with birdsong or light, but with stillness, the kind that only visits after a long silence has been honored. The sky outside was overcast, the clouds a soft, colorless stretch across the horizon, and the streets below barely stirred. But within Elsie's apartment, everything was different. She awoke before her alarm, her breath slow and even. The notebook still lay closed on the desk, its spine gently curved the pages within resting complete. No new names would appear. No forgotten stories would press themselves against her thoughts in the dark. The door had closed, not with force, not with finality, but with peace. She stood and moved through her space, taking time with each motion. Her hand brushed over the skipping rope, now coiled like a sleeping thing. The lunchbox sat unopened, but no longer heavy with silence. The marble gleamed in the sunlight, its cloudy center calm. Each artifact remained unchanged, but no longer haunted. They were no longer weights. They were reminders, echoes not of pain, but of presence. At the window, she stood for a long while, watching the breeze ruffle the leaves of the sycamore tree outside. A child passed below, laughing, running too fast, chased by a sibling or a friend. Elsie smiled faintly. She had not spoken of the stories to anyone. No one had come to ask. But something told her that others somewhere had felt it, like a knot gently loosening, a whispering ceasing. An empty seat at the table finally claimed again. She returned to her desk and opened a new notebook, clean, fresh, unfamiliar. Not out of habit, out of readiness. She would write again, but not of hauntings, not of names and shadows. This next story would be her own. Still calm, still quiet, still hers. She wrote on the first page. When the stories ended, the silence remained. But I was no longer alone in it. A pause, then another line. The house at the end of Alley 7 was never just a house. It was a threshold. And I walked through. She looked up at the mirror. It showed only her reflection now. A little tired, a little older, but certain. Elsie Lane, the girl who listened, the one who remembered, the one who stayed until the end. And so her story, like theirs, settled into its final form. Quiet, whole, seen. You made it. We've reached the end of our story tonight, and I want you to take a deep breath with me. Inhale, and slowly exhale. You've been walking a quiet road with me through a house that remembers more than it reveals, through mirrors that reflect more than just faces, and into the memories of those who waited so long to be heard. The journey wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was soft, steady, like footsteps in an attic, or the hum of wind under a door. And now, you've arrived safely on the other side, where the air is a little clearer, and the dark isn't quite so heavy. Let your eyes close if they haven't already. Let the room settle around you, wrapping you in the same stillness that followed Elsie's final page. There are no more names to write, no more knocks at the mirror, just the sound of your own breath. And maybe if you listen closely, you'll hear them one last time, not calling out for help, but whispering their thanks. Because you listened. Because you stayed. So rest now. The stories are safe, and so are you. Good night.